In a bright and beautiful palace, a scream echoed, someone calling out for a girl. This tall, slender, red-haired girl is our heroine, Rosetta, urgently summoned by the warning cries. The next step was the last. A foot in a black high-heeled boot landed clumsily on a liquid, and the owner's body inevitably tilted downwards. The falling girl, known as the trembling fawn of the royal palace, was a renowned maid whose name resonated throughout the entire palace. Rosetta was known for her excessive gentleness, which caused her to frequently faint at any opportune moment. Her absent-mindedness always brought immense chaos and trouble, like the day before, when she accidentally knocked over a rack of plates while cleaning, shattering them into large pieces. Such a person would typically be considered quite resilient, but Rosetta easily overturned this notion. She fainted at least 3 times a week. However, despite the chaos she constantly caused, the other maids held no ill will towards Rosetta. This wasn't entirely due to her beautiful appearance or noble birth, as it might seem on the surface. The key lay in the girl possessing an indescribable charm that attracted everyone around her. However, the main reason for their sympathy was entirely different. The other maids stopped their work and sent Rosetta to him. After all, everyone who had worked with him had fled the palace in tears in less than 3 days. And here he was, our male protagonist, gloomy, solitary, with an expressionless face, known as the Mad Prince. Rosetta smiled and thanked the others before leaving. For now, she was to serve as Prince Armand Baldwin von Ragnar's personal maid. As she approached his chambers, she saw 2 men, one of whom was carrying a tray with a tea set. But taking another step forward, she noticed something amiss. A glint of light flashed from beneath the tray. The servant had hidden a sharp dagger under the tray, preparing to bring it into the prince's chambers. And the second man, despite seeing this, showed no reaction. Rosetta, with a strange smile, asked what they were doing. Her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze gradually darkened, as if suspiciously asking if they intended to harm the prince with that. The 2 men exchanged glances and chuckled, finding the question both strange and naive. The first man waved his hand dismissively, scoffing that even the palace's trembling fawn had arrived. The one holding the dagger gripped it more firmly, realizing that someone had seen what they shouldn't have, and thought she was certainly doomed. It was as if a dark force was gathering around Rosetta, but there was no one else around, and the 2 men weren't worried about anyone stopping them. One of them even yelled an apology in pity, mercilessly brandishing the dagger, intending to kill her. With a sudden movement, the dagger was aimed straight at the girl's heart. The blade made a faint sound, accompanied by the rustling of clothes and hurried breaths. However, the dagger pierced the heart of the man who hadn't expected resistance. As she released the falling body, she heard the dying man's surprised words, asking if she didn't find it a pity to work here with such skills. The second man froze in shock, recalling everything that had happened before, finally understanding that Rosetta had been hiding her true identity. His final conclusion before death was that all previous attempts to assassinate the prince had failed precisely because of her presence. One swift movement, the glint of the dagger, and the splatter of blood. It all happened too fast. 2 bodies lay in front of the prince's chambers, silence all around, broken only by a beautiful female voice saying, "Those who see what they shouldn't have must die." The red-haired girl continued to smile gently, carefully wiping the blood from her hands. Suddenly, someone called her name, and another maid hurried after Rosetta. Rosetta turned around, and the girl who caught up to her asked in surprise why she had taken so long. Rosetta scratched the back of her head sheepishly, admitting with a shy smile that she had accidentally fallen into a pond. That's why she was delayed. Meanwhile, images of the bodies sinking into the water and the blood-stained white apron flashed through her mind. The girl looked at Rosetta, smiled indulgently, and waved her hand, urging her to hurry, saying the prince was looking for her. Rosetta thanked her and, like a fawn, skipped towards the prince's chambers. As soon as she reached the door, she immediately apologized for being late. Then she waited quietly for a response. Black hair, snow-white skin, a calm demeanor, and sharp golden eyes made one tremble nervously. Armand was looking at her just like that, and Rosetta felt that he was the real, trembling fawn, having already died 4 times. Determination flickered in the girl's eyes. She would save him, at least in this lifetime. That was precisely why she had made the right decision now, to become the prince's maid instead of a knight. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low male voice, almost a whisper, uttering her name. Armand lifted her chin with his fingers, capturing everyone's attention, and finished his sentence, declaring her to be his Rosie. He leaned closer, a smile playing on his lips, and continued his low murmur, confessing he'd almost gone mad waiting for her. His face suddenly flushed crimson, leaving her wondering why. His thumbs slid from her chin, caressing her skin, finally resting on her lips, tracing their shape. They stood in the center of the bright, spacious room, practically touching. Only the thought, this is highly inappropriate, jolted Rosetta back to reality. The massive castle appeared solemn and mysterious until a scream shattered the magic. Night cloaked the castle, illuminated only by intermittent flashes of lightning, making it appear even more sinister. A woman's voice called out a man's name in the silence. Valerian. Rosetta, clad in knight's armor, her hand gripping her long sword, was visible only when lightning flashed. She spoke to the man in the room, asking him to turn back time. A man with waist-length blonde hair sat in a chair, gazing at her melancholically. He worried about the consequences of such a decision, but Rosetta remained unconcerned, leaving him to watch her in silent sorrow. Rosetta Mayfield, the Crown Prince's personal knight, had failed to protect him. To atone for her failure, she used the sword gifted to her by the prince to return to 10 years prior. In her first return, she only wanted to correct her mistakes, but she found the prince lying in a pool of blood, reaching out to her. She grasped his blood-soaked hand, only able to hear the name he whispered in his final moments. As she leaned closer to his body, she was shocked to discover he had been murdered before her return. If Rosetta couldn't prevent Armin's death, she would return to the age of 20. Each time I returned to the past, I tried to prevent the tragedy, but each time I only encountered death. To break the cycle of death, she tried to tell the prince about her return, hoping to fight together, but this plan was also doomed to fail. Now, Rosetta still hadn't given up hope of saving the prince and was waiting for her fifth return. Having tried other methods, she chose the only way that allowed her to calmly enter the prince's room and stay by his side at all times. And so, Rosetta became a maid in the royal palace. Two maids stood before the prince's bedroom door, one informing him that they were there to introduce the new maid. Thus, Rosetta entered the prince's room, something she wouldn't have been able to do as a knight. The girl greeted him with a cheerful smile, introduced herself, and pledged her loyal service to the prince. Armand sat by the window, legs crossed, a book in his hand. A stifling silence filled the room. After a long pause, without even looking up from his book, he uttered a single emotionless word, "Good." Outwardly calm, Rosetta's heart burned with a fierce fire, threatening to consume everything around her. The prince hadn't even glanced at her. Hurt, she was surprised by the change in his attitude. He hadn't been so dismissive before. Closing the door, the heartbroken girl thought that this was the first time she had been treated with such indifference. Such an attitude would have been enough to crush other girls, but not Rosetta. She walked confidently through the palace corridors, beginning to formulate a plan. The prince's behavior, ironically, became the motivation for her to slowly approach his heart. Rosetta continued to plot her next moves, completely unaware of the girl staring at her from behind. The girl, a sneer playing on her lips and an eyebrow arched, scoffed. Looking at Rosetta, Melanie was puzzled. She thought there must be something special about Rosetta to become the prince's maid, but apart from her face, she couldn't see anything remarkable. She smiled maliciously, thinking she had to put Rosetta in her place before she started flaunting her position. Acting on her thought, upon encountering Rosetta in the corridor, Melanie casually remarked that the maid's uniform suited her better than a regular dress, believing the plain fabric was practically made for her. Rosetta turned to Melanie, a shy smile on her face as she clenched her fists, saying she also liked the uniform very much and thanked her for the compliment. Melanie's eyes widened in shock as she stared at the maid, concluding that she had nothing but flowers in her head. Now, Rosetta had a new nickname, a fool with a lovely face. Rosetta took Melanie's hand, saying the uniform would suit Melanie as well, leaving her with no choice but to agree. The other maids, led by the relentless Melanie, continued to watch Rosetta, hoping to catch her in a moment of falsehood. Turning around, Rosetta saw Melanie calling her again. Melanie held a bag of cookies in one hand and offered Rosetta a cookie with the other, urging her to try it, saying it was especially for her. Melanie practically shoved the cookie into Rosetta's mouth, ordering her not to share it with anyone else, but to eat it herself. Rosetta chewed with some difficulty while continuing her work, and Melanie, humming contentedly, walked towards the other maids. Another maid, noticing how Melanie was now treating Rosetta like a child, remarked that she used to dislike Rosetta the most. Melanie sighed awkwardly, placing a hand behind her head, admitting it was true, but that it hadn't lasted. If anyone pointed out Rosetta's mistakes, she would immediately apologize. After finishing her assigned tasks, she wouldn't stop but would actively look for other things to do, following the methods Melanie had taught her. Another positive trait was that she helped the other maids with their work. Melanie said it was impossible not to like someone like that, but that wasn't the main reason. Rosetta, holding the cookie and smiling, seemed to radiate light, illuminating everything around her. The girls giggled shyly, noting that Rosetta's smile was dazzling even to them. They continued discussing Rosetta, concluding that someone who could smile like that must have an easy life, unaffected even by Prince Armand. The mention of the prince reminded Melanie that it was her turn to clean his room today. Another shriek echoed through the quiet palace, resounding in every corner. Hearing Melanie scream, Rosetta immediately came over, wondering why she had cried out so loudly. Rosetta hugged Melanie to comfort her as she explained that it was her turn to clean the prince's room, but Rosetta still didn't understand what was so frightening. She continued looking at the girls as one asked if she had heard the rumors. A terrible rumor was circulating throughout the palace, everyone whispering that the prince had gone mad. Melanie wiped her tears and turned towards Rosetta's voice. Rosetta pointed to herself, offering to clean the prince's room in Melanie's place. Melanie, moved to tears, cried out Rosetta's name. Walking down the hallway, the girl recalled the instructions, knock twice, state her purpose, and humbly await the prince's response. The girl's fist knocked twice on the prince's door with confidence. Remembering the next step, she announced that she was there to clean and patiently waited for a response. Inside the bright room, a man's figure held a book, and a clear, strong word echoed. Enter. The door opened, letting in the light, and Rosetta, with a happy smile, thought that the time to tame Armand had finally come. The man leaned against the wall, arms crossed, silently and intently watching Rosetta. The girl considered how to win the prince's favor. As she made the bed, she pretended not to notice Armand watching her, thinking that he seemed to prefer quiet maids, but then she would be no different from the others. With this thought, Rosetta snuck a glance at the prince. His expression seemed to say that if she acted too familiar, he would be even more wary than before. Armand was originally only the second in line to the throne. He had experienced many dangers and, as a result, had become distrustful of everyone. Because of this, he had no dedicated attendants and personally supervised the cleaning. The girl lightly touched the dried flowers with her finger, thinking that this was probably the reason for the rumors and why others were reluctant to serve him. Turning to the prince with a smile, she decided he was just strict about his work. The girl looked out the window, then turned to speak to the prince, but fell silent. Armand continued to watch her silently, waiting for her to say something. A gentle girl, with a smile on her face, illuminated by the sunlight. Her clear voice announced that she had finished cleaning, and all of this left Armand stunned, his mouth slightly open in surprise. He continued to watch her silently, unsure of what had just happened. Rosetta, still smiling gently, commented on the beautiful weather and requested permission to open the window for some fresh air. Armand, regaining his composure, interrupted her, saying that if she had finished cleaning, she could leave. The girl agreed, and Rosetta walked dejectedly towards the door, the prince still watching her. Suddenly, at the door, she turned back and, with a smile, told him that he could call her anytime if he needed anything. The door closed quietly, and absolute silence returned to the room. The silence lasted only a moment. Suddenly, a loud crash came from behind the closed door, followed by a voice asking Rosetta why she'd bumped into them again and telling her to watch her feet. Then came a whimper. Prince Armand continued to stare at the door, only able to guess that the strange occurrences were due to the girl's clumsiness. Melanie trailed behind Rosetta, repeatedly asking if she was all right and if anything terrible had happened. Rosetta, hands on her hips, replied cheerfully and calmly that there was no need to worry, as she was quite sturdy. Melanie, however, strongly disagreed. Rosetta continued, declaring that from now on, she would be the prince's exclusive maid. Melanie stared at her, momentarily unsure if she had misheard. After all, even experienced maids refused to work for the prince. Could Rosetta truly handle it? The girl insisted she could, claiming the prince was kind to her. As if sensing he was being discussed, the prince's ears suddenly itched. Melanie thanked Rosetta and urged her not to faint in front of the prince under any circumstances. The girl hummed softly, slowly polishing the beautiful table. Prince Armand watched her every move, feeling something was amiss. Her words and actions were constantly contradictory. She came to clean every day, despite initially saying it would be every 3 days. Yet, despite this, she didn't dawdle like the others or disappear without reason, which wasn't a bad thing. The girl's bright voice interrupted his thoughts, asking if he wanted to go for a walk, as the weather outside was lovely. As Rosetta continued to chatter, Prince Armand closed his eyes and lowered his head in resignation. This girl's only flaw was her talkativeness. Oblivious to Armand's reaction, Rosetta enthusiastically offered him a jam cookie she had been given. The prince cut her off with a single word, enough. The girl seemed not to hear the gloom in his tone. She responded cheerfully, but with no intention of giving up. She changed the subject, forcing Armand to remind her again that she could leave if she was finished. So, Rosetta sullenly headed for the door, thinking to herself that she never overstepped and didn't even have anyone to confide in. In a moment of weakness, the girl felt that despite her weeks of effort, his heart hadn't opened to her at all. But this weakness quickly dissipated, and she encouraged herself not to be discouraged, to be even more persistent tomorrow. The next day, Rosetta greeted the prince, who watched her silently, as usual. Armand sat at his desk, sipping tea from a cup held between 2 fingers. Rosetta suddenly stopped her work, froze, and called out to him in a strange voice. Armand turned to Rosetta in surprise, just as she abruptly apologized to him. The cup fell from the prince's hand, tea splashing everywhere. The chair overturned, and Armand landed on the floor. Rosetta threw herself on top of him. The prince's eyes widened in shock, staring at the scene before him, unable to comprehend its meaning. Rosetta, still holding him, pried his mouth open with her thumb. Armand only had time to cry out a name. Richard. He yelled for help. Rosetta, unfazed, simply told him to open his mouth wider. In response, Armand bit down hard on her finger, drawing blood, and the girl whimpered in pain. She decided on a different approach, pulling his shirt closer with both hands. Whispering an apology for her rudeness, her warm breath brushed against him, and the touch of her soft lips left Armand utterly bewildered. His eyes opened. He watched as Rosetta continued to kiss him. Rosetta opened her eyes to find herself lying in bed, her messy scarlet hair spread across the sheets. As she sat up, she heard the prince's voice asking if she was awake. Armand sat in a chair, one hand covering his face. Rosetta was utterly shocked to hear the unbelievable words. The prince promised to take responsibility for her from now on. Before Rosetta lost consciousness, she had kissed the prince. There was always a reason for a sudden kiss. While cleaning the room, the girl pondered how to become friends with the prince more quickly. But having lived her life as a knight, her mind was blank. Her thoughts were interrupted by the aroma of tea, a scent she knew well, a deadly poison. Unsure how much he had drunk, she decided to at least get the tea out of his mouth. Just then, a blond man with a terrible scar over his left eye, Prince Richard, burst into the room. Seeing the scene before him, he was momentarily stunned. Richard began to inquire about the now unconscious prince's condition, completely oblivious to Rosetta's pleas. With her last bit of strength, she urgently ordered Prince Richard to fetch a priest. Recalling the events, she realized she was still thinking with the mindset of a 30-year-old, completely baffled by how she had lived before. Prince Armand watched her intently, asking how she knew the tea was poisoned. Rosetta gave an embarrassed laugh and brushed it off, claiming she'd encountered the scent before. Remembering the important matter, she excitedly asked if the culprit had been caught. Looking directly into her eyes, Armand replied that the culprit had committed suicide. Rosetta worriedly inquired about the prince's health. He reassured her that he was fine, and that was why he was there. Rosetta looked at the prince, feeling he hadn't changed much, his manner of speaking still not particularly endearing. However, the man sitting in the chair had clearly answered her questions, and for that alone, she would willingly drink poison 100 more times. The hand resting on the prince's knee suddenly clenched into a fist. Armand looked directly into her eyes and told her plainly that she had consumed too much poison and would likely die in a few days. Rosetta froze, slowly comprehending his words. Now she finally understood why he was being so kind. Believing her to be ill, he told her to contact him if she needed anything. He would fulfill her wishes before she died. To make sure Rosetta understood completely, he added that she was dying in his place. But the girl continued to look at him in confusion. Rosetta knew that normally this much poison would be fatal, but for her, the host of the ball, everything would be all right. Rosetta smiled slyly, thinking that if she didn't reveal the truth, she could easily claim the poison was harmless to her. But she immediately dismissed the idea, realizing this might be a golden opportunity. Smiling, she told the prince that everything was fine and not to worry about her. Perhaps she wouldn't die, as she was quite strong. Looking at her, Armand had thought she was foolish, but clearly, the poison had made things worse. Still, he stated frankly that her chances of survival were slim. The girl lowered her head dejectedly, urgently requesting him to grant her wish and to hurry before he changed his mind. She asked to be allowed to stay by his side, to serve him until the very end. Armand looked at Rosetta carefully, reminding her again that she was dying, and if she was making such a request, she didn't understand him at all. Annoyed by his suspicion, the girl stated she had no interest in jewels and only wanted to serve for the sake of her legacy. Armand found the request heavy, but he understood her desire to find meaning in her life. He gently touched her shoulder, softly promising to watch over her during her final days. Rosetta sat there, smiling blissfully. She had finally received what she had longed for. Looking over his documents, the prince listened to the girl suggest he call her by her nickname, surprised by her talkativeness despite her limited time. Rosie smiled and agreed to be quiet so he could read aloud. The man brought a fist to his lips, clearing his throat, and began to read from the parchment. He declared that he, Armand Baldwin von Ragnar, Prince of the Ragnar Empire, appointed Rosetta Mayfield as his sole personal maid. Finally, the agreement would last until the death of Rosetta Mayfield. Melanie burst in, practically screaming hysterically, asking how this could be. Why was Rosetta going to die? She cried, insisting it couldn't happen. Although Rosie said it was a misunderstanding, the prince, to appease her, said the priest had already treated her and there was no need to worry. Rosetta twirled around in front of Melanie, showing she was unharmed, finally convincing her that everything was all right. Relieved, Melanie excitedly rushed towards the girl, hugging her tightly. Holding Rosie's hand tightly, Melanie invited her to spend the night in her room. Lying in bed, holding hands, they laughed and reminisced about old times. Looking at Melanie, Rosie realized she'd never had time for friends before, and it felt wonderful. Following her heart, she confessed her desire to befriend someone else and asked for advice on how to get closer to him. Upon hearing this, Melanie jumped up and asked if the person was a man. Thinking of the prince, Rosetta confirmed Melanie's guess, then wondered if it was too forward to ask. Melanie blushed, assuming it was Prince Richard, much to Rosetta's surprise. From Rosie's reaction, Melanie realized her mistake and expressed sympathy for the gentleman in question. She didn't forget to offer her best advice. To get closer to a man, more physical contact was necessary. Armand, arms crossed, firmly refused to help with bathing, denying any improper habits. Rosetta continued to list the benefits of her assistance, making me nervous. The prince pressed his index finger against her shoulder, reminding her again that he wouldn't do that sort of thing, and if she continued to ask, he would think she was plotting something. Armand smiled, certain that any noble lady would flee in embarrassment after hearing such words. Rosetta, however, took his outstretched hand, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and asked what would happen next. The man jumped back in alarm, while Rosetta smiled with satisfaction, thinking he finally understood her desire to be close to him. Holding a towel in both hands, she dried his washed, damp hair. Seeing this, Rosetta immediately offered to help Armand change his clothes. The man's patience finally ran out, and a shout echoed through the room as he reminded her that he could manage everything himself. After closing the door, Rosetta grumbled about the prince's stubbornness, not noticing Richard standing there. The man smiled and asked if she was talking about the prince. Startled, Rosetta asked him to keep his secret. Richard laughed heartily, promising to keep his mouth shut. The man inquired about her health, having heard rumors from the other maids. Rosetta reassured him that she was full of energy. Recalling his rudeness from the previous day, the man apologized, but she brushed it off, urging him to be more concerned about the prince. Richard placed his hand on her shoulder, expressing surprise and admiration for Rosetta's loyalty. Rosetta, unsure of what was happening, found it strange to receive such praise from a high-ranking knight. The man continued to surprise her, asking if she was free this weekend. However, Before Rosetta could answer, Armand was standing beside them, telling her he needed her help with something urgent. He glared at her, displeased to find her flirting with someone else when she should have been interested in him. After Armand left, Rosetta came to her senses and asked if they were going to the main palace, and if she could go too. The prince refused. With a pitiful expression, she hugged her arms, promising to shield him from the sun and tell him interesting stories along the way. Armand looked around, silently reprimanding her. He relented, saying she could come if she held the umbrella. Rosetta happily agreed. 3 men in uniform held up an umbrella that looked incredibly heavy. Richard was surprised. The umbrella was so heavy. How could the delicate Rosetta possibly hold it? Holding the umbrella, she smiled and began telling a story about the tiers of Ilky earrings and their owner, the king of the Asper Empire. Rosetta looked at the prince, smiling brightly as he listened with interest. She had known him for 10 years and was surprised that she could understand his thoughts just by looking at his face. Armand asked her how she knew this, and she answered shyly that she couldn't remember clearly. It was a long time ago. A memory flashed. Rosetta standing beside the fallen king, the earrings in her hand. She stopped abruptly, saying that was enough stories for today, as they had arrived. No one had noticed they had arrived. Captivated by her story, the men continued to stare at her. Richard was the first to recover, apologizing for being so engrossed in the story that he forgot to ask how she could hold such a heavy umbrella. Folding the umbrella, Rosetta laughed, chiding him for underestimating a maid's work and admitting she was quite strong. Richard laughed, but Armand remained silent. He recalled how tightly she had gripped him. With a displeased twitch of his lips, he broke off his thoughts and strode ahead, urging the others to follow. Rosetta smiled, thinking that holding an umbrella was nothing compared to wielding a sword. Even so, a 20-year-old body was much weaker than a 30-year-old one. It would take at least 5 more years to become a master swordsman. She felt a pang of frustration. A maid's work was tiring, leaving no time for training. Only Valerian Windsorfruit could do everything. He became a grand mage at 15, the pride of the empire. He gave up the title of Master of the Magic Tower to devote himself to the royal family. To Rosetta, he was a closer friend than family. Now, because of her work as a maid, she rarely saw him. A male voice called her name, Rosetta. She looked towards the voice in surprise, hardly believing her eyes. Valerian was actually running towards her, exclaiming how much he had missed her. Valerian reached out to hug Rosetta, but she lifted her leg, displeased with his public display of affection. Her foot, clad in a small black boot, stomped hard on his toes. Rosetta grew even angrier, yelling at Valerian for being a pervert, since he could have dodged but didn't. Tearfully, he explained he only endured the pain to make her happy. When Valerian was young, his family fell into decline and Rosetta's mother took him in. Rosetta became both a guardian to his younger sister and a companion to him, while he cared for her like a lost little sister. Rosetta also regarded him as an older brother, trusting him completely and feeling comfortable in his presence. His only flaw was being overly affectionate with girls. Seeing his pitiful expression, people would immediately forgive him anything. Rosetta, arms crossed and a disgruntled look on her face, reminded them that she was just a maid here and was tired of the gossip surrounding them. Rosetta sighed and promised to visit Valerian's laboratory after she finished her duties. Finally, she told him not to worry, as she had made friends in this lifetime. Valerian laughed, almost in disbelief, and asked if he could hug her. Engrossed in their conversation, neither noticed the prince standing beside them, watching intently. Rosetta and Valerian embraced tightly, a gentle smile on Rosetta's face. Continuing to hug him, she promised herself she wouldn't be swayed by such emotions again, as she was, after all, a well-bred young woman. Valerian wished her good health while he was away. They turned and departed in opposite directions. After a few more steps, Rosetta encountered the prince and greeted him. Armand remained silent, watching her with a somber expression. Armand suddenly leaned towards her, demanding to know who the man with her had been. Rosetta wondered if the prince had seen their embrace, having completely forgotten that Armand, as crown prince, had undergone vision training. Reminding herself to act natural, Rosetta replied that he was a friend she had made while working in the main palace. Armand commented on her friend's height, and Rosetta smiling, agreed that he was well-built. The prince thought gloomily, wondering if Rosetta was secretly seeing someone. Rosetta read all his thoughts on his face, smiling, yet displeased that everything was ending in suspicion because of him. As the prince continued to question her about her friend's occupation, Rosetta coughed violently, pressing a hand to her lips. She immediately insisted she was fine, but a blood-stained handkerchief slipped from her hand, and then, rolling her eyes back, she fainted at the prince's feet. Armand lunged forward, catching her just in time, one arm around her waist. Time seemed to stop, breath held, the distance between them almost non-existent. Rosetta was bewildered. She hadn't expected the prince to catch her, especially since he was still suspicious of her. Whether or not his conscience was pricked by this, she couldn't say. Deciding not to let this opportunity slip, Rosetta thanked the prince with a smile for catching her, saying she owed him her life. The prince's hand clenched into a fist with a click, one thought echoing in his mind. It was all because of him. He felt as if he had already killed her. Rosetta looked at Armand in confusion, his reaction completely unexpected. Wanting to correct the misunderstanding, she said she was fine, but warned him that his skin would suffer if he stayed in the sun too long. Armand raised a hand, ordering her to return inside, a stinging sensation spreading through his palm. Back in the palace, Rosetta admired the prince's dexterity, thanked him again, and offered to help him change his clothes. But Armand refused, tried to avoid her attentiveness. He claimed he had only caught her to avoid ruining his reputation. Rosetta cursed under her breath, certain he had been watching her earlier. Armand's melancholic gaze and behavior reminded her of the cat she had kept as a child. It always pretended to dislike her, but in reality, it cared a great deal. Startled by her smile, the prince urged her to leave quickly, stating he had only tasked her with cleaning the bedroom. Rosetta continued cleaning while Armand resumed watching her. Noticing a vase of wilted flowers on the table, Rosetta wondered if the prince would be interested in such a thing, guessing another maid might have left them. Seeing Rosetta pick up the vase, Armand told her to leave everything as it was. Realizing the flowers might have been a gift from someone special, Rosetta asked if they had been given to him by someone important. The prince gave a short nod in confirmation. Rosetta thought the flowers were likely from Leah Riniera, whose family had close ties to the royal family. As the only daughter in her family, the girl's name alone was enough to place her in high society. In the past, Rosetta's half-sister had tried to attract Riniera's attention, but Rosetta hadn't been interested. As the most skilled knight, she had never crossed paths with the young lady. However, despite all that, the name remained etched in her memory, because years later, that lady married Armand. Leah Riniera and Armand's marriage was merely for show. Armand's difficult personality made their relationship quite strained. As she arranged the blankets on the bed, Rosetta thought that if those two could get along this time, her life would be a little easier. Armand suddenly interrupted her thoughts. He had noticed Rosetta cleaning more diligently lately. Rosetta smiled and replied that changing the sheets daily was good for the skin. He scoffed, saying it was just superficial. Rosetta cried out in indignation, unable to comprehend how someone with such an appearance could say such a thing. His skin was soft and beautiful, pleasing to the eye just to look at. So what was the point of saying such things? Armand, who had never doubted his own appearance, was surrounded by people too afraid to speak their minds. Rosetta was the first to dare comment on his looks. Rosetta continued to fume, unable to understand how he could say such a thing. If his appearance was his greatest asset, she wouldn't even be here if it weren't for that face. Armand was angered, unsure if she was mad or had simply lost her fear due to her impending death. Rosetta realized she had gotten carried away and said too much. She tried to appease him, lowering her head and asking for forgiveness. Armand watched her, unsure if she was crying or not. He was surprised by her lack of reaction to her imminent demise. Rosetta, also unsure if he had forgiven her, decided, with a knight's ingrained thinking, to kneel as usual. Armand turned his head away, telling her to forget it since she was still ill. Rosetta apologized again and abruptly knelt before him. Armand froze, pulling her up in a mixture of anger and surprise, asking what she was doing. At that moment, his heart sank as he realized something. Her hands were far too thin and frail. The realization calmed him instantly. He told her to stop with such pointless gestures. Rosetta, still kneeling, smiled with satisfaction. Kneeling had indeed been effective. Armand, unable to forget the softness of her hands, clenched his fists, trying to dispel the sensation. Suddenly, Armand asked an unexpected question, leaving Rosetta dumbfounded. He asked if she liked boats. Surprised, she raised her hands, assuring him that she did. He replied, "See you tomorrow at 11 in the morning." He added, to the bewildered Rosetta, that he had decided to give her a pleasant memory before she died. Rosetta left the room, leaning against the door, wondering if he was deliberately trying to confuse her. The next morning, a girl in a pretty white dress stood in the park, looking around. Two men, Armand and Richard, walked towards her along the path, side by side, like two opposing forces. He ordered her to stop yawning and sit down. Rosetta pinched her cheek. If he was being this rude to her, it couldn't be a dream. A carriage passed through the verdant forest, taking Rosetta to ride a boat. Armand looked at her, wondering why she was dressed like this today. With her hands folded in her lap, she replied that she didn't have anything else to wear. Richard was surprised, assuming she hadn't brought clothes from home yet. She denied that the clothes he had provided were suitable. This outfit was the most appropriate for boating. Armand stared out the window, incredulous that there weren't any more respectable, noble garments available. She was originally a noble, now a maid, her hands calloused. It seemed she must have been mistreated at home. He continued to gaze out the window, thinking that she had probably suffered her whole life and now had to die in his place. Unlike the prince's gloomy thoughts, Rosetta simply found dresses inconvenient for training, leaving her with only trousers. She looked into the distance, wondering if the lack of clothes was really that serious. Having made up his mind, Armand turned to her and offered to buy her clothes if she needed them. Unaware of his inner turmoil, she refused outright as she didn't need any. The two men stared at her in surprise. Rosetta thought that the most important thing to her was the prince's life. The carriage wheels suddenly stopped. They had finally arrived at their destination. She hopped lightly out of the carriage and, turning back, extended her hands towards the door, intending to help the prince down. Both men were stunned. Rosetta, slightly embarrassed, realized her knightly habits had momentarily taken over. A beautiful scene unfolded before them. Clear lake water surrounded by green trees and vibrant flowers. A small white boat waiting quietly by the shore. Delighted, Rosetta urged the prince to hurry onto the boat, but he told her she could go by herself. Surprised, Rosetta realized the prince intended for her to row alone. She stood there, unable to comprehend how anyone could enjoy rowing by themselves. After all, despite what she had said to the prince yesterday, she didn't actually enjoy rowing. But wanting to be alone with him, Rosetta, touched, wiped a tear from the corner of her eye and softly asked if she truly had to row alone. Seeing such a touching display, Armand felt a little uncomfortable and finally agreed to accompany her. Happy, Rosetta hopped over to him and took his large hand in her small one. Annoyed, the prince set a condition. Rosetta had to remain silent for the entire trip. The girl immediately covered her mouth with both hands. Richard followed behind the prince, overjoyed and hardly believing he'd have such an opportunity. He began fantasizing about future travels with the girl, silently resolving to thank the prince. He didn't immediately notice the prince had turned to block his path. Lost in his daydream, a surprised Richard didn't understand what was happening. Armand calmly explained that for safety reasons, at least one person needed to remain on shore. Richard was speechless. It was indeed a good reason. The little white boat carried its passengers automatically across the clear surface of the lake. Rosetta thought it was even more beautiful than she had imagined. The girl gazed at the scenery, as beautiful as a painting. The prince noticed her gaze, and Rosetta asked him if he enjoyed rowing. The man frankly admitted he did not. A boy struggled in the water, crying for help. Many people stood around, laughing, but no one offered assistance. The boy slowly sank beneath the surface, a single thought in his mind. He couldn't protect anyone, not even himself. Armand confessed his dislike of swimming stemmed from a bad memory. Rosetta worriedly wanted to say something, but the prince told her not to mind it. To change the subject, Armand remarked that Rosetta must have endured much being assigned to his palace. The girl interrupted him, confessing she had come willingly. Armand was shocked by this confession, knowing the servants disliked working in the palace, and he longed to understand why she volunteered. Rosetta stood and, extending her hand towards him, said she had come to protect him. Armand covered her mouth with his hand. Looking away, he asked if she had enough strength to do so. Rosetta reminded him that he had seen her hold an umbrella and that she had saved him once. Armand was angry, for that was precisely how she lost her life. A sudden jolt, a foot in a black boot, inevitably pushing its owner off balance. Rosetta tumbled into the prince's arms, her hands bracing against his shoulders. The distance between them suddenly closed. Stunned by the suddenness of it all, the girl couldn't speak, only continuing to gaze into his eyes. Armand held her, his gaze fixed on hers, finishing his sentence. She hadn't been able to save her own life. He grasped her slender, delicate wrist, thinking that if she couldn't even withstand such a light push, how could she protect him? The prince continued to gaze into the girl's eyes, silence hanging between them. Rosetta's cheeks flushed, her heart pounding violently. She didn't understand what was happening to her. In the middle of the lake, the man and the girl remained embraced, the silence broken only by the sound of their heartbeats. Physical contact wasn't something Rosetta found shameful. She and Valerian had held hands, hugged lightly. It had all felt natural. But falling into the prince's arms like this, Rosetta felt incredibly awkward. The girl repeatedly told herself not to be shy, to imagine it was Valerian. This is Valerian. This is Valerian, she kept telling herself. Finally, Rosetta smiled and thanked the prince for saving her life. The prince asked how long she intended to sit on his lap, and Rosetta cheerfully replied she would continue sitting so she wouldn't fall again. This answer left Armand utterly speechless, lost in thought. The girl immediately jumped off his lap, saying she didn't dare, as they were His Highness's legs. Armand sat down and told Rosetta he didn't understand how she could face a man she'd given her life to protect with such composure, a man who didn't even have time for himself. They sat in the boat, facing each other, the atmosphere somewhat awkward. The girl spoke, saying she was doing this to protect him. The reason Rosetta kept returning was because Armand was her first failure. The girl blamed herself, feeling she hadn't protected her master well. But when I returned, all other emotions gradually faded, leaving only a single burning desire. She wanted him to live, but he would never know. Rosetta smiled slyly at the man, sticking her tongue out, finally declaring the reason would forever remain a secret. Armand was utterly shocked by the girl's actions and dissatisfied with her answer. Rosetta continued to smile, saying every maid has her secrets. Armand found the whole situation ridiculous. Rosetta interrupted him, confessing her genuine desire to protect him. The boat's engine roared, and Armand fell silent. Many had said the same words. As she spoke, the engine noise grew more jarring, the atmosphere tenser. Rosetta and Armand sat in the boat, listening to the cacophony, trying to understand what was happening. Listening intently, Rosetta felt the engine failure was no coincidence. She warned the prince to be careful, as the water was deep, but he didn't notice he was already overboard. Prince Armand slowly sank, still looking up, thinking only that everyone who spoke like Rosetta had ultimately betrayed him. He forced his eyes open and saw Rosetta. She was reaching for him. The girl placed her hand in the prince's, their fingers intertwining tightly. Surfacing, the girl gasped for air, struggling to regain her breath. She turned to the prince, asking him how he felt, and embraced him, pulling him towards the shore. Richard, waiting on the bank, threw a rope to help pull them up. He was astonished to see Rosetta carrying the prince from the water. She held him in her arms, her crimson hair cascading around them, blue eyes sharp as blades, ready for battle. Prince Armand lay in bed, covered with a blanket. Opening his eyes, he saw Richard and Rosetta sitting by his bedside. Richard reported that while he was unconscious, he had used magic to dry and change his clothes, so he needn't worry about gossip. Armand asked how much time had passed, and was told less than an hour. When he asked if anyone else had seen, he was informed that Richard had brought him back as discreetly as possible. When he asked why a priest hadn't come, Richard paused before admitting a young priest had assisted. Upon hearing that the high priest was delayed due to his eldest son being injured in a duel, Armand clenched his fists nervously. He already knew the current empress, the eldest son's mother, was trying to control the temple. Staring at a nearby stream, he recalled everything that had happened. It had all been orchestrated. Having heard all he wanted to know, he dismissed Richard. Rosetta also prepared to leave, but was stopped by the prince. Returning to the prince's bedside, the girl wondered if she was being punished for her boldness, or perhaps for holding Armand. She was even more surprised when the prince thanked her, saying he owed her his life twice. Rosetta turned away, covering her face with her hand. The prince grew anxious, thinking she was crying, and urgently asked what was wrong. Rosetta turned back, smiling, admitting she was simply happy he had thanked her. Hearing her response, Armand told her to tell him if she ever needed anything. Rosetta refused again, saying she was fine as long as he was safe. The prince insisted it was the price of his life, and he was willing to repay it in any way as long as she stated her desire. Rosetta fell into thought, recalling their embrace in the boat. After a brief silence, Rosetta firmly requested an embrace as her reward. Armand was stunned, asking if he had heard correctly. The man lifted the girl, saying if that was truly what she wanted, he would grant it. Armand knelt on the bed, placing her down, his hand braced beside her. Rosetta lay on the prince's bed, Armand kneeling above her. Looking up at him, a surprised Rosetta asked why the embrace had to be on the bed. Armand awkwardly replied, thinking it would be more comfortable. Rosetta laughed delightedly, exclaiming he was right. Saving a life certainly warranted a high price. Armand sat on the bed and asked if she desired anything else. Soft light enveloped the girl's figure. She stood by the window, a gentle smile playing on her lips, and uttered words that could stop a heart. She wanted more. Rosetta lifted her skirt, revealing parchment hidden on her thigh, and said an embrace would also do. An embrace and afternoon tea would also suffice. The girl listed her wishes, spreading the contract before him, demanding he fulfill her requests daily. Armand, surprised, asked when she had written the contract. The satisfied Rosetta frankly replied that she had prepared it long ago and kept it with her, just in case. Armand sighed. The prince admitted he wasn't thrilled with the arrangement, but his own fate demanded an equal price. Rosetta, surprised by his quick agreement, thanked him. The prince got out of bed and went to the table to sign the contract. He thought to himself that it wouldn't last long anyway. She wouldn't live much longer. Just as Rosetta and Armand turned around, a knock came at the door. A maid announced the arrival of a priest, followed by the Grand Mage. Rosetta froze, utterly shocked that Valerian had come to the prince's bedchamber. She quickly realized that if he saw the disheveled bed, the damp clothes, and her messy hair, there would be a huge commotion. When they were younger, Valerian had once beaten up a rich kid who bullied her. Rosetta wanted to warn Valerian, but he told her to wait. Although the bedchamber door was closed, the commotion outside was still audible. The maid and the two men waited for a response, completely unaware of what was happening inside. Finally, the prince allowed them to enter. The door opened, and a sliver of light from the hallway spilled in. The priest bowed to the prince. "Your Highness," Valerian greeted the prince, his gaze fixed on the prince's hand stroking Rosetta's hair, his eyes full of displeasure. He clearly didn't like the scene before him. Armand's fingers continued to stroke and comb through the girl's hair. Rosetta remained motionless, speechless as she felt his fingers weaving through her tresses. Rosetta turned slightly to the prince, questioning his actions with her eyes. Armand, understanding her unspoken question, leaned down and whispered in her ear that her hair was too messy and others would surely notice. Valerian, his eyes fixed on the scene, remarked that the prince had just experienced some unpleasantness. Armand looked at Valerian darkly, suspecting the rumors had already reached the main palace. Valerian smiled, saying nothing in the imperial palace escaped his notice. He added that since the priest had arrived and the prince was unharmed, he and the prince's maid could leave the room. Armand glared at the speaker, while Rosetta quietly moved towards the door. Valerian reminded the prince that he needed treatment and they would wait outside. The Grand Mage urged the girl to leave, but before they could exit the bedchamber, Armand told them to wait. They exchanged glances, anticipating what would happen next. The prince pointed at the girl, instructing her to stay. Rosetta, slightly embarrassed, softly asked why. Valerian's anger surged like a wave, his gaze fixed on the prince. The man and the girl each had different thoughts. Valerian prepared to protect Rosetta if the prince mocked her, while Rosetta hoped her friend would restrain himself. Armand told the girl to stop being stubborn and accept treatment if she didn't want to hasten her meeting with death. The girl quieted, cheerfully agreeing. With his shirt open, The prince sat as the priest began the treatment. Rosetta couldn't help but compare the prince to her cat, who would also heal her. The girl looked at the prince in surprise. He had been shy when they bathed together last time, but now he was completely composed. The prince's voice interrupted her thoughts, asking the priest to examine Rosetta. After the treatment, the girl continued to smile as the prince informed the priest that she had ingested a deadly poison a few days prior. Rosetta was shocked, completely taken aback by this revelation. The prince asked the priest if he could alleviate her suffering, as Rosetta was said to be nearing death. The priest, touched by Armin's concern for Rosetta, promised to do his best. Rosetta was stunned. If the priest did as asked, everyone would know she wasn't dead. The girl steeled herself, realizing there was nothing she could do now that things had come to this. Rosetta placed her hand on her chest and confessed she couldn't accept the treatment. Armand looked at her, wondering why not. Covering her face, Rosetta admitted she was naturally shy and would prefer a female to treat her. The man was filled with questions upon hearing this. Armand dismissed the priest with a wave of his hand and turned back to the girl, questioning her shyness again. Valerian, knowing it was an excuse, couldn't help but laugh. He placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, remarking that treatment did require exposing certain parts of the body. He looked at Rosetta, surmising she was reluctant to expose herself before a man. Armin's expression darkened further as he watched Valerian's actions. Seemingly unconcerned by all that had transpired, Valerian promised to take good care of the maid, urging Armand to focus on his treatment without worry. Still smiling, the Grand Mage excused himself, claiming he had pressing matters to attend to. Armand was utterly shocked by the Grand Mage's blatant rudeness and lack of decorum. Rosetta and Valerian left the prince's bedchamber with somber expressions, neither speaking a word. However, once they were some distance away, both of them burst into laughter. A man sat at a table, asking what kind of tea they would like. Rosetta remarked that she disliked wasting magic, only to be told that nothing concerning her could be considered a waste. The girl took a sip of tea and asked Valerian why he had come to the palace, but the man countered by asking why she hadn't told him anything. The man pressed her, asking who had tried to poison her. Rosetta frowned, saying the person was already dead, either by suicide or silenced. Gazing at her reflection in the teacup, the girl recalled her resistance to poison. Valerian was filled with rage, unable to ignore what had happened. Rosetta looked at the man, who lamented that she hadn't told him sooner, leaving him to only fuss over her now. Valerian continued to question her about how she fell into the lake, and the girl explained about the problem with the boat. Picking up a sugar cube, the girl added that the prince had suddenly lost consciousness, and they both fell into the water. Valerian crossed his arms, remarking that the prince's collapse and fainting were suspicious and likely a reaction to poison. Looking at a knife, the girl said that if that were true, it would be attempted murder. Valerian pondered for a moment, then asked Rosetta if she had seen anything suspicious in the room. Rosetta replied that it was hard to say, as the room was very clean. The only thing that bothered her were the wilted flowers in the vase. Valerian promised to investigate the flowers, but expressed concern that she, a former knight, wasn't carrying a sword. Rosetta told him not to worry, and with a flash of light, a sword appeared in her hand, which she casually concealed. It was the sword with time magic that the prince had given her. Watching her, Valerian asked if she truly cared that much for the prince. The girl, misunderstanding, simply spoke about the sword. The enraged man abruptly stood up from the table, exclaiming that he was asking about the prince, the person she repeatedly risked her life for. Hearing her response made him practically breathless, and of course, it was important. Smiling, the girl gripped the sword, stating that the prince was the master to whom she had sworn her loyalty. Struggling to contain his emotions, the man clenched his fists and said he respected her choice. Placing a hand on his chest, he declared that he wouldn't stand by and watch her in danger, so he would also take action. Touched, the girl embraced him, thanking him for his help. The man had helped her in every lifetime, and this time, she would strive to make it the last. Rosetta walked down the palace corridor, thinking she could tell the prince she had already met. The priest was still pondering the flowers, hoping the problem didn't lie there. Those wilted flowers, which the prince had kept, were a gift from Miss Rhaenyra. However, After reading Valerian's message, she learned that her suspicions about the flowers were correct, and the accident on the boat was no coincidence either. Realizing her judgment was accurate, she understood she couldn't let her guard down yet. Rosetta approached the prince's bedchamber and greeted Richard, who was standing guard at the door. The girl was about to enter, but turned to face the man who spoke to her. Blushing and smiling, the man wished her a good day. The girl was surprised, as Richard hadn't been like this in their past life. She pushed open the door and entered the prince's bedchamber. Upon entering, the girl greeted the prince with her usual smile. The prince, as always, responded silently with his gaze. The girl remarked that the room was a bit messy today, thinking to herself that he looked even more handsome with his hair down. Suddenly, the prince said that the mage had some concerns, which was why he came. It was to check the reaction to the poison. Feigning ignorance, the girl smiled and asked about the results. Armand said darkly that the flowers were in the vase, but before he could finish, he fell silent, then looked up and demanded the truth from the girl. The man abruptly stood and quickly approached her. Leaning down, he pressed Rosetta, asking if she had seen the priest and what he had said to her. Nervously, the girl replied that she had seen the priest, and he had told her she was stronger than she looked and would therefore live a long life. Stroking his chin, the man chuckled softly and asked how long ago that was. Smiling to herself, the girl thought, he still doesn't know. Rosetta tried to interrupt, saying she needed to clean the room. Before she could take a step, the prince stopped her, telling her not to touch anything. She assumed he wanted a rest, but he corrected her, saying he wasn't trying to force her to work. Confused, Rosetta reminded Armand that she was his maid. The prince, slightly embarrassed, looked angrily at the uncompliant girl. He turned away, sighing in frustration, and said he didn't want her collapsing from overwork. Rosetta secretly wiped away tears of emotion, thinking that the poison would have been a blessing. Lifting her skirt, she retrieved a broom from her waist, stating that she was his personal maid. With a languid look, Rosetta softly pleaded with him not to take away her happiness, for she served him wholeheartedly. Looking at the prince, who had turned back to face her, she said with a hint of resentment that if she didn't clean here, she wouldn't be able to see him. He finally relented, allowing her to do as she pleased. Two women approached the prince's bedchamber. One confidently knocked on the door. The maid's voice announced Lady Robin, requesting an audience with the prince. Armand told them to wait for him in the drawing room. However, the door was suddenly pushed open. Lady Robin, her face full of displeasure, rushed in and grasped the prince's hand. The prince looked at her and gently asked what brought Betty there. The woman tearfully explained it was because of what happened yesterday. Still holding her hand, the prince urged her to calm down and sit, assuring her that he was fine. The woman sat, her head bowed, an empty vase on the table opposite her. She looked up, surprised, and placing a hand on her chest, told the prince she could have brought him fresh flowers, but he insisted on keeping the wilted ones. Hearing this, Rosetta smiled. The kind lady wasn't Lady Ranila, but Lady Roblon. Everything made sense now. Lady Roblon had raised Armand. Seeing her concern for the prince and his natural tenderness towards her, just like in the past life, Valerian asked, somewhat nervously, if the nanny remembered who she had given the flowers to that day. Lady Roblon said she had given the flowers to a maid. Armand asked if it was Countess Miriam, and Lady Roblon confirmed, saying she couldn't refuse her request. The lady wasn't the culprit. She had no reason to kill. But the Countess was a pawn of the current queen. Now Rosetta understood why there had been no evidence, saying it was inappropriate for her to remain in a grown man's bedchamber. The woman left. Rosetta, smiling, followed her out. The lady asked Rosetta if she was a new maid, and she nodded. The woman chuckled, wondering how long she would last. Rosetta smiled back, assuring her that serving the prince was her joy. Pleased, the woman asked a special favor of her, something she was afraid to ask anyone else for fear of being misunderstood. Rosetta clenched her fists, firmly stating her willingness to do anything for the prince. The woman's request to care for the prince at night stunned her. She refused, saying she couldn't fulfill such a request. The lady apologized with a smile, clarifying that she only meant for Rosetta to look after him if necessary, nothing more. Only then did Rosetta understand, imagining Armand asleep. She agreed, but wondered if the prince would approve. The lady smiled again, saying that if she arranged it, the prince wouldn't be able to object. Once in the carriage, she expressed her happiness that Armand had such a good girl by his side. Walking down the corridor, Rosetta was stopped again. She turned to see the head maid, who asked with concern what she had discussed with the lady. Smiling, Rosetta mentioned the lady's request. The head maid coughed, expressing her worry that Rosetta's frequent visits to a grown man's bedroom would cause gossip. Rosetta continued to smile. The head maid, agitated, warned her that if she valued her life, she should stay away from the prince, especially at night. Carrying firewood to the fireplace, Rosetta reflected that in her 4 lifetimes, this was the first time she found the head maid so disagreeable. Arriving at the princess's chambers, Rosetta saw the guard by the door, fast asleep. She remarked dryly that he must work very hard. Hearing the girl's voice, the man woke up, surprised to see Rosetta. He asked her why she was there so late. The girl gestured to the firewood in her hands, mentioning the fireplace. The man said the prince had ordered that no one be allowed in at night, but he figured Rosetta was an exception. Rosetta smiled silently. The man clearly didn't understand common sense. Rosetta entered the bedchamber. She didn't like this guard. He was careless about his work and not vigilant enough. Leaning over to look at the sleeping prince, she thought he looked like an angel and wished he could be like that in reality. As she continued to observe him, the prince suddenly opened his eyes. Rosetta's smile froze on her face. She was completely at a loss for words. The girl started wringing her hands, stammering that it was really very simple. But before she could finish, the prince's strong hands grabbed her wrists. The next moment, Rosetta found herself pinned to the bed. Armand braced above her with both hands. Faced with this situation, Rosetta nervously asked for forgiveness, saying he had misunderstood. Looking closely at him, the girl noticed his unusual expression. A thought flashed through her mind. Perhaps the prince suffered from sleepwalking. But before she could figure it all out, she decided to get away first. The girl moved awkwardly, trying to slip out from under him, when she suddenly realized something was pressing against her. She tensed up instantly. Even more flustered, she begged His Highness to wake up, but it was no use. The prince leaned down and kissed her lips. Realizing that this wouldn't work, the girl kicked him with all her might. She grabbed his wrists and flipped their positions, now pinning him down. Anger flashed across his face, and a sneer curled his lip. The girl understood that this wasn't like him normally. Now he was more like a wild beast. At this moment, Rosetta finally understood. The rumors about his madness weren't due to his personality, but because of this illness. The girl raised her hand, wondering if he treated other maids this way too, but quickly dismissed the thought. After apologizing, the girl placed her palm on the prince's forehead and cast a spell. Regaining his senses, the prince cleared his throat, realizing what had just happened. He looked at the girl and asked her why she was there. His hand left the cup and saucer clinking together. The prince handed the girl a cup of calming tea. Rosetta thanked him, still shocked that he had personally made tea for her. The downcast girl confessed that she hadn't come there for no reason, but at Lady Robin's request. Armand asked her to tell him what she had just seen. The girl recounted everything, but he didn't react. The prince, displaying a surge of strength, suddenly lunged at her. Armand slammed his fist on the table and asked, "So I'm just a beast acting on instinct?" The prince looked away, realizing he had caused trouble in his sleep again, and the girl understood this wasn't the first time. Armand looked at the girl and apologized for what had just happened. Rosetta replied that she wasn't hurt at all. Armand asked her how she had managed to subdue him, considering the strength he had used. Rosetta smiled, reminding him that she had already told him she was strong. Armand told her not to joke. Setting down her cup, Rosetta placed her hand on his elbow and suggested an arm wrestling match if he didn't believe her. For the first time tonight, Armand gave a cheerful smile. He placed his hand on the table, gripping hers tightly, reminding her that she was the one who suggested it, so she shouldn't cry if she lost. The prince smiled, thinking she would soon see the results and wouldn't be able to say that anymore. He told her to begin, but she had already applied force. Their arms strained, neither giving way. The prince stared at their hands in surprise, completely baffled by where the girl's strength came from. Rosetta laughed, saying she was just naturally strong, and teased him about whether he wanted another round. The next second, the prince watched in shock as his hand was slammed onto the table by the girl. Armand continued to stare at their hands, dumbfounded. He couldn't say a word. The girl released his hand and, pointing to herself, asked if she could ask him a question since she had won. Rosetta asked him if he was going to dismiss her too. The prince remained silent. Rosetta reminded him that she hadn't yet made him fulfill her wish for the day and that, according to their agreement, he had to grant her one wish every day. She held his hand and stated her wish for the day, not to fire her. The prince sighed, lowered his head, and asked if she was afraid of him. Rosetta realized Armand wasn't acting this way intentionally. He asked her how she could be so sure, still holding her hand. She replied that he was a good person and she wanted to protect him. Armand fell silent, contemplating the madness he had suffered for 3 years, a madness even the priests couldn't cure. If the first prince found out, he would have a reason to attack him. Because of this, no maid who knew his secret had survived. Yet, Rosetta had saved him twice. She was a special maid. Watching him, Rosetta listened as Armand invited her to move to a room closer to his. With his arms crossed, he requested she attend to him at night. Armand felt that calling her special wasn't quite right. Unique was more accurate. Standing before an ornate door, Rosetta called out for Valerian, announcing her arrival. The man immediately opened the door with a delighted expression, surprised that she had come to see him. As soon as she stepped inside, he asked her why she was in that man's room last night. Rosetta was taken aback by the way he referred to the prince, demanding to know why he spoke of him so disrespectfully. Valerian put his arm around her shoulders, pleading with her to tell him the rumors were false, that she hadn't been in the prince's room last night. Rosetta remained silent, watching as he gripped her hand tightly. Surprised, she asked him why he was so angry. He replied that the rumors claimed she had shared the prince's bed last night. The furious girl cried out, enraged by whoever had spread such nonsense. Just then, the blind from last night swayed in the street. Valerian sighed in relief, saying he knew it was all lies. He gestured towards the room, offering to make her some coffee. Eating a pancake, Rosetta commented that after having these, everything else seemed bland. Popping another pancake in her mouth, Rosetta marveled at the peace and quiet of the palace. She suggested Valerian tell her about his past life, something he had been looking forward to. After she finished, she asked him what he thought about it. A gloomy Valerian said he didn't like that she kept returning, just because of a certain man. Looking at her friend, Rosetta wondered why Valerian disliked Armand so much in this life. Suddenly, he stood up and walked over to her, wiping some cream from her face with his finger. He remarked that it was surprising she could be so careless and still work as a maid, then licked the cream off his finger. Rosetta pushed herself up, a sly smile on her face, and grabbed his hand, saying he should lick the rest off too. Rosetta gazed into Valerian's eyes as she licked the remaining cream from his fingers. He was astonished that his little sister had become such an elegant lady, angrily scolding her for her actions. But then, with tears in his eyes, he asked if she only wanted to work in his laboratory. She silently refused. However, seeing his saddened expression, she hesitated. She hadn't been returning for no reason. Placing her hands on her chest and undoing the clasp of her dress, she said if he wanted to make her happy, he could grant her request. Valerian stared in shock, completely bewildered by what was happening. Rosetta pulled a scroll from her bodice and showed it to him, asking him to create a device that could detect all poisons. He continued to stare as she explained that such devices existed, but they couldn't detect all poisons. Valerian closed his eyes, trying to compose himself. Without opening his eyes, he asked if the prince needed the device, stating his dislike for him. Rosetta looked a little disappointed, but he said he would help regardless. He added that he was only doing it to keep her out of danger. She thanked him for his help, a warm smile directed at her friend. She hugged him, bidding a hasty farewell, explaining she was moving to the room next to the prince's and needed to move her belongings. Watching her leave, he gaped, wondering where exactly she was moving to. Turning away from the doorway, he muttered that he had never been so jealous. Rosetta smiled as she looked around the room, quickly packing her things. She didn't have much. Her thoughts were interrupted by Melanie rushing in. Rosetta was glad she had come looking for her. Melanie blurted out, asking if Rosetta had really slept with the prince last night. An indignant Rosetta vehemently denied it. Melanie pressed further, asking if it was a lie that Locke had said Rosetta was in the prince's bedroom all night. Rosetta crossed her arms and explained she had simply been cleaning and ended up falling asleep on the sofa. Melanie sighed in relief, admitting she had let her imagination run wild. Melanie pondered various things, but still asked Rosetta why she was moving next door. Rosetta reminded her that, As a personal maid, she should always be nearby. Hearing the words, "next door," Melanie smiled slyly. Armand entered the room, just in time to hear Melanie ask Rosetta if the prince was the person she wanted to be close to. Intrigued by the conversation, he paused, hearing Rosetta admit it. His eyes widened when Melanie asked Rosetta if she liked him. Rosetta, a little embarrassed, said that even if she denied it, Melanie wouldn't believe her. Armand watched the two girls chatting and laughing, one question capturing his full attention. Did Rosetta really like him? Watching the girls leave, he couldn't help but wonder if this meant she had always had feelings for him. Meanwhile, three maids glared daggers at the man, as if ready to tear him apart. The grim-faced Richard ordered him lower, placing a foot on Roy's back, forcing him to bend further. The boy tearfully begged Rosetta for forgiveness, but Richard's foot pressed down harder, ordering the guy to address Rosetta as you. The man apologized again. Rosetta pleaded with Richard to stop, as the boy seemed innocent. Richard, however, said he'd never liked the guy and now finally had a reason to teach him a lesson. Rosetta only hoped he wouldn't spread any more rumors. Melanie indignantly asked Rosetta if that was enough, but Rosetta simply didn't want the rumors. Richard was surprised by her leniency. Rosetta explained that the boy had seemed tired lately, and she'd even seen him dozing on duty. Richard repeated, shocked, dozing on duty. He grabbed the guy by the collar and dragged him away, saying they needed to have a private conversation. Rosetta wondered if she shouldn't have said that last part. The prince's bedchamber. Sunlight filled the room, bringing brightness and freshness. Armand held a book, almost covering his entire face, only his eyes visible as they stealthily followed the girl. Rosetta cleaned the room as usual, dusting and wiping, but something felt off. She abruptly turned to the prince, finding him suddenly looking away. The prince completely hid his face behind the book, pretending he hadn't been looking at her at all. Confused by Armand's unusual behavior, Rosetta asked the prince if she had done something wrong. Still looking at his book, the prince said everything was fine and told her not to worry. Noticing his flushed face, Rosetta asked if he was feeling unwell, but he suddenly raised his voice, saying he'd already said he was fine. The girl moved closer to the prince's face, asking him to look at her. She gazed at his slightly reddened face, while the prince thought to himself that she had no idea he'd overheard their conversation. Recalling the conversation, he wondered if that was the reason for her strange behavior today. So, the girl really did like him, but why did he feel uneasy every time he looked in her eyes? Rosetta watched Armand, waiting for his response. After finishing her cleaning, Rosetta approached the prince, requesting him to fulfill a wish of hers. The prince looked up at her and agreed. Clasping her hands together, Rosetta asked the prince to call her name. Seeing Armand's surprised expression, she explained that he had never called her by her name. The prince asked her why she wanted him to call her name. She replied that being called by one's name by someone special instantly lifts one's spirits. Armand silently repeated the words "someone special," understanding she wasn't hiding her feelings at all. He sighed and agreed to call her name whenever necessary. Rosetta was a little disappointed, thinking the prince wouldn't grant her wish. Armand suddenly asked her what the priest had said to her today. Rosetta, a little embarrassed, said the priest had told her she was in good health and could live for another 100 years. The prince nodded, giving her permission to leave if she was finished. Rosetta agreed, feeling a bit down. The door quietly closed behind her as she left the princess's chambers. Armand sighed, recalling Rosetta's words about being healthy and living for another 100 years. Walking down the corridor, Rosetta felt uneasy about the prince's unusual behavior today. She felt that something unexpected might happen. The head maid called the girls over again. She told Rosetta to follow her, saying Countess Miriam was looking for her. The countess was a supporter of the current queen. Why would she be looking for Rosetta? Entering the countess's room, Rosetta saw a lady sitting in a chair and curtsied. The beautiful lady, dressed in black, looked at Rosetta and asked if she was the prince's closest maid. Lowering her head, Rosetta quietly and humbly confirmed that she was the prince's personal maid, Rosetta. The lady narrowed her eyes and smiled, finding it amusing that the prince would allow a maid. Moving closer, Countess Miriam observed the girl who stood quietly and respectfully. Rosetta was quite beautiful, she concluded. Annoyed, Rosetta thought that feigning ignorance was crucial in this situation. She smiled and thanked the countess. The Countess continued her interrogation, asking if the girl had truly spent the night in the prince's room. Maintaining her humble demeanor, Rosetta replied that as instructed by Lady Roblon, she had merely replenished the fireplace and left immediately. Countess Miriam's smile widened at the girl's response, a chuckle escaping her lips. She said she had no doubt that was how it happened. Then, still with a faint smile, asked if the girl had seen anything suspicious. After a pause, she asked if the girl had seen anything in the prince's room last night. The women in the room exchanged silent glances, trying to gauge each other's thoughts. With a slightly somber smile, Rosetta wondered if Countess Miriam was testing her. Looking at the Countess, Rosetta dismissed the thought. The Countess would only know what Maria Sr. Maid had told her. Rosetta remained silent, thinking that since the Countess knew about the deaths of the servants, she must also know about the prince's nocturnal cruelty. With this in mind, the girl asked about the suspicious matter, feigning contemplation. Having decided what to conceal, she began to speak, saying that the prince had slept so soundly, without a single sound, that she had worried for his health. The Countess smiled and began to inquire how and when Rosetta had arrived, then paused. She continued, remarking on how the girl's tongue could lie so brazenly. Rosetta remained silent, waiting to see what would happen next. The Countess lowered her head, smiling, and asked if the girl knew that she did not tolerate dishonesty. With that, she curtly ordered Rosetta's tongue to be cut out. Just then, the Countess's door burst open, and several men in black cloaks entered, seizing Rosetta and twisting her arms behind her back. The girl let out a muffled groan of pain. The men held the girl's arms firmly behind her, forcing her head down, preventing her from looking back. Rosetta thought that if it weren't for the Countess's presence, she would have taken them all down in an instant. Revealing her abilities now would undoubtedly arouse suspicion. Rosetta decided on a different tactic, crying out that she had done nothing wrong and that everything she said was true. The man holding her tightened his grip, asking if these were her last words while she still had a tongue. Rosetta closed her eyes, forcing herself to remain calm. The girl hesitated, torn between fighting her way out or sacrificing her tongue to protect the prince's secret. After a moment of thought, the girl chose the latter. It would be painful, but Valerian could heal her later. Her head bowed low, her voice soft, as if afraid to defy the punishment, but not admitting to knowing anything. The man, with a malicious grin, asked if she had any more lies to tell, instructing her to stand still so he could finish quickly. The girl stared resolutely into the man's eyes, thinking that enduring pain for the prince was nothing. However, everything was interrupted by a man's voice, asking what was happening and what this entertainment was. Rosetta looked up in shock at the man entering the room. With his arms crossed, the man smiled and asked why they were holding the poor servant. Graham Isabel von Ragnar. The dagger fell from the man's hand. Everyone in the room bowed deeply, greeting His Majesty. Countess Miriam, without looking up, asked why His Majesty had graced them with his presence. Maintaining his posture, the prince replied that he had come to visit his mother and, hearing screams, couldn't ignore such treatment of a beautiful girl. Gesturing with his hand towards the still-seated girl, he expressed his own interest in the poor servant. Countess Miriam immediately responded that such matters were unworthy of his attention, as the girl was merely the prince's servant. The man began to walk forward, saying that it was even better, as he hadn't known Armand had such a girl attending him. He leaned down, lifting the girl's chin with his finger, and murmured for her to come with him. The girl chuckled softly, feeling the prince's hand grip her shoulder tightly. Watching the man leave, the girl thought that Graham was the most loathsome person she had ever encountered in her past life. He had mocked her, saying a girl shouldn't wield a sword. When he learned of her skills, he had even tried to recruit her. The girl continued to follow the prince through the garden, relieved that her tongue was still intact, but still wanting nothing to do with him. The man stopped, turning back with a smile, and asked for the little darling's name. The girl thought the prince was utterly mad, but she still called out his name. The man turned to the girl and asked if Rosetta understood that he had saved her from danger. He extended his palm, gesturing for her gratitude. Rosetta asked again, confused. The man leaned down and asked why she was pretending not to understand. He placed his hand on her cheek, emphasizing that she should work with her body. This man was Graham Isabel von Ragnar, the first prince of the Ragnar Empire and Armand's rival for the throne. But while Armand had been raised with strict discipline as a prince, Graham had been raised by Countess Miriam due to his royal blood. Growing up in such an environment, the prince took a step closer to the girl, reminding her again of what he wanted. The prince's hand landed on the girl's waist, pulling her closer. The prince was notorious for his deplorable behavior. Graham put his arm around her shoulder and leaned close to her ear. Rosetta clenched her fists, trying to stay calm, just wishing for once that she could at least teach this jerk a lesson. The man pressed her back against a tree, harder and harder. Rosetta stood there, contemplating her plan, starting with a kick. Suddenly, a male voice called out, saying he had been looking for her. Armand stood before them, his voice imperious as he asked what she was doing there. Pinned against the tree by Graham, the girl looked at Armand in surprise. He had come. The man extended his hand and ordered Rosetta to come. The girl was shocked that the prince knew her name. Rosetta looked at Armand, admiring his attentiveness. She pushed Graham away and readily agreed, running towards Armand. The girl stood behind Armand, while Graham rubbed his chest, wondering how Rosetta could have such strength. Armand asked Graham sternly what he was doing with his maid. The man just laughed, a sardonic expression on his face. Graham was surprised that Armand had come so far for a mere maid. Looking at the man and the girl peeking out from behind him, he asked mockingly why he was concerned with such a lowly person instead of finding himself a bride. He then suggested that Armand go prove himself to his mother, so she might find him a good bride. Rosetta thought he was right, because when the emperor was unwell, the right to choose a prince's bride belonged to the empress. That was why Armand had not been in a hurry to get engaged. Rosetta looked at the man, thinking this to herself. Faced with Graham's suggestion, Armand smiled and advised him to worry about himself. He crossed his arms, expressing pity for Graham's fiancée, who would have to constantly be wary of a prince who always pestered young women. Then he speculated that Graham was merely dissatisfied with his fiancée's low birth. Hearing this, Graham was furious, cursing Armand in his mind. He had never liked him. On the palace balcony in the evening, a young blonde boy looked down below. The boy happily thought that he had finally been recognized as a prince and could live in the palace, the whole country now beneath his feet. His pleasant thoughts were interrupted by a female voice announcing the arrival of a new prince. Two maids passed through the castle courtyard, walking beneath the balcony, discussing the newly arrived Prince Armand of royal blood and how some were not friendly towards him. Hearing this, the little boy clenched his fists, trying to calm himself. At first, everything was fine. Armand was young, and Graham knew he was powerless against bullying. But at some point, everything changed and people began to compare them. From academic achievements to swordsmanship, everything was a competition. Graham tried to harass or beat him, but Armand simply ignored him. Graham stormed into Armand's room, angrily demanding to know why he dared to tell their father. Armand didn't even look up, retorting that he hadn't said anything. Closing his book and looking up, he added that although he remained silent, everyone around them could see what was happening. Graham cursed inwardly, thinking that if he had known this would happen, he would have gotten rid of all the evidence. The boy went to his mother to complain, but she told him to be patient and humble, otherwise he would never surpass Armand. Kneeling before his mother on the throne, the boy took those words to heart. From that moment until now, Graham had tried to control his emotions, but now everything had changed. The man closed his eyes and lowered his head, calling out Armand's name. He thought that as long as Armand lived, he would never become emperor. He roared and lunged at the prince, calling him a bastard. Armand smiled indulgently, knowing he could easily dodge, but if Graham actually hit him, it might become a useful bargaining chip. Both were stunned. Something neither of them had anticipated happened. Rosetta was struck and collapsed to the ground. The girl lay unconscious, a scream echoing through the park as someone called her name. Armand, his heart pounding, stared at the fallen girl, desperately calling her name, yearning for a response. Graham stood by, watching the scene unfold, hoping the girl wasn't dead. If this were discovered, the consequences would be dire. The man took a few bewildered steps, turned, and fled in a panic. Behind him, Armand shouted his name. Armand watched Graham go, vowing he wouldn't escape accountability. Holding his head, Armand forced himself to calm down and focus. Helping Rosetta was paramount. He cursed, looking at the girl, wondering why she always had to protect him. The girl cracked open an eye, looked around, and asked if Graham had left. Armand stared, dumbfounded, his mouth slightly agape, completely taken aback. Rosetta, sitting in his lap, innocently asked the prince if he liked her performance, if she had been convincing. Armand could only manage one word. Why? Rosetta didn't answer, thinking that someone like Graham couldn't possibly hurt her. Armand stood before the girl, still kneeling, and asked her again why she put herself in danger. Rosetta lowered her head and said it was necessary, of course. She stood up, looking earnestly at the prince's face, and said she just wanted to protect him. The prince, his gaze filled with sorrow, understood. Suddenly, he leaned in close, his eyes fixed on hers. At that moment, Rosetta thought Armand was angry, perhaps shocked that a woman had been struck before him. Preoccupied with the thought that Armand couldn't possibly imagine her as a swordsman, she didn't notice the prince extending his hand. The next moment, the girl could only manage an indignant, "Your Highness." The man, unfazed, scooped her up into his arms, ordering her to stay still and explaining that he was taking her to a priest. Despite her protests that she could walk and wasn't even bleeding, he shushed her, insisting on carrying her to the temple himself. Rosetta, stunned by his actions, was at a loss for how to dissuade him. He carried her off in full view of everyone, completely unconcerned with propriety. Finally, deciding to try and mitigate the situation, the girl said it would be embarrassing to appear at the temple in this state and suggested summoning the priest who had visited the bedchamber earlier. The prince agreed, telling her to stay put and chiding her for talking so much when she was unwell. Two men stood at the entrance to the bedchamber, Prince Armand and the knight, Richard. Richard broke the silence, asking Armand why he wasn't inside with the injured Miss Rosetta. Armand replied that Rosetta didn't want to be seen while the priest treated her. Richard smiled knowingly, thinking to himself how gentle his highness was with Rosetta. Silence fell over the corridor again, each man lost in his own thoughts. Armand thought to himself that he should frankly admit that every time he saw this girl, he felt like something would happen to him if he stayed with her too long. Every time he saw her, his face would flush and his heart would race, and he always wanted to hold her tightly, to stay with her a little longer. The man smiled softly at these thoughts, put his hand to his head, and couldn't help but chuckle, causing Richard to turn and look at him. Oblivious to Richard's surprise, he muttered to himself, wondering if he was going mad. Meanwhile, Rosetta apologized to the priest for deceiving him into thinking he was treating the prince. The priest graciously said it was all right. He felt honored to be held in such high regard by her. Rosetta looked at the man, thinking that Theodore was indeed a very talented priest. However, at this moment, the man's talent was not appreciated by the archbishop, which was a good thing for the prince. The girl smiled at Theodore and quietly confessed that his highness wanted him to be her personal physician. The man was surprised by this secret and could only ask uncertainly, really. Rosetta thought that since Theodore wasn't on the archbishop's side, it meant he wasn't on the empress's side either. Sitting on the bed, she looked at the priest, thinking that this gave her and Armand a chance to bring him to their side. The man, still flustered from the earlier excitement, almost forgot to treat the girl and hurriedly asked where her wound was. Rosetta quickly reassured him that she was fine. The man looked at the girl in confusion, so Rosetta explained that his highness was simply overreacting. She gently touched her neck, saying it was just a scratch, and urged the man to attend to it. Armand turned at the sound of the door and saw Rosetta and Priest Theodore emerge from the room, walking calmly. Armand, arms crossed, asked if they were finished. Rosetta immediately replied that she was fine. Armand then turned to the priest, thanking him for coming to the palace so promptly. Priest Theodore cheerfully steepled his fingers, thanking her and saying it was his honor to be of service. But Armand's next words stunned Rosetta. He asked Theodore about Rosetta drinking the deadly poison, setter, and why she was still alive after so long. Rosetta immediately understood and indignantly called out to the prince. Both men looked at her in surprise. Rosetta froze, having cried out instinctively. To cover her outburst, she said she had an urgent matter to discuss with the prince and quickly walked towards Armand. Then, standing on tiptoe, she covered her mouth with her hand and whispered something in his ear. After a moment of silence, Armand spoke to the bewildered Priest Theodore. "Please leave." Theodore thanked his highness and hurried away, leaving Rosetta and the prince alone in the corridor. Armand walked silently towards the bedchamber, Rosetta following behind. Armand stopped abruptly and turned to ask if she was coming to the bedchamber today. Rosetta looked surprised, unsure why she would suddenly go there. Armand repeated the question, trying to clarify what she had meant earlier. Rosetta explained that she remembered the prince saying his illness acted up whenever he worried too much. The prince lowered his head, saying he didn't need to worry. He was fine, and she was the one who should be worried about herself. Their legs pressed close together. A man and a woman. Rosetta leaned against the wall and indignantly called out to His Highness, trying to push him away and ordering him to wait. Armand grabbed her hand and pulled her closer. Seeing this, Rosetta realized the situation was bad. The man gently brushed his thumb across his lips, staring intently at her, observing her reaction. The prince was acting crazy. Normally, Armand was more elegant than any nobleman she had ever met. But now, holding her and pulling her towards him, he resembled a beast more than a human. Rosetta was displeased by his blatant display of desire. They were still locked in a stalemate, him pulling her closer, her desperately pushing him away. Rosetta tried to bring the prince back to his senses, looking directly into his eyes and saying this was wrong. She gripped his violently trembling wrist. Rosetta thought to herself that the archbishop had said this illness was incurable, but since he was on the first prince's side, perhaps he was lying. It was very possible that Armand was simply cursed and Valerian was powerless against it, a curse that turned the prince into a beast. The prince broke free from Rosetta's grasp, and the girl cursed angrily again. The man jumped back, his shirt open, and cautiously crouched down, hands on the floor. The girl watched him, wondering if she had gripped him too tightly. She noticed the man's gaze, a look that felt familiar. After a moment of thought, the girl remembered her cat, Vilo, who always had that same look before a bath. Could Armand really have turned into a beast? The thought made Rosetta laugh, reminding herself that the prince was not Vilo. She looked at the man, who was gritting his teeth, and called out again. Picking up a feather duster, she waved it back and forth, showing the prince what she was holding and commenting on how amusing it was. She swished the feather duster back and forth, the feathers making a pleasant rustling sound on the floor. The girl continued to ask the man what she was holding, the prince's gaze following the moving feathers intently. The man's pupils suddenly contracted. The girl invited him to play, and the man, like a beast, growled low, his eyes fixed on the feather duster. Seeing this, the girl smiled in satisfaction. She moved the feather duster to the other side, and the man immediately pounced. The man jumped excitedly, his eyes glued to the feather duster's every movement. The girl continued to tease him, hardly believing her eyes. Prince Armand was really acting like a cat. More importantly, watching the scene unfold, she found it even more amusing than she had imagined. The girl reached out towards the prince. The man, seizing the moment when Rosetta's guard was down, suddenly pounced on her, knocking her to the floor. He pressed his full weight onto the girl, pinning her down. Rosetta lay on the cold floor, trapped beneath Armand's body. She asked him to wait, but the prince didn't react to her words. Gripping his shirt, she pulled him off with all her strength, shouting for him to stop, telling him she refused. The man sprang back, freezing like a startled cat, looking at her in confusion. Free! Rosetta got up from the floor and stepped forward. Looking back, she ordered the man sitting on the floor to get into bed. Tonight, she was in charge. Silence filled the room, broken only by the crackling fire in the hearth. She pressed him down onto the bed, firmly stating her intention to teach him the meaning of the word no. Looking at Armand growling beneath her, Rosetta thought she'd noticed similar behavior while training her cat, Vilo. She covered his mouth with her hand, reminding him that this wasn't right, that taming a beast required patience. They lay side by side on the bed, eyes closed. His hand reached for her waist, hers rested on his shoulder. Rosetta stopped his hand, reminding him again that he couldn't do that. She reminded him again and again, yawning until tears came to her eyes. Finally, both drifted into an uneasy sleep. Even in her dreams, she continued to say no. Dawn broke, painting the sky with light. The world awoke, and the castle bustled with activity as people hurried to their posts, chattering cheerfully. Richard approached the prince's bedchamber and knocked, asking if His Highness was awake and if he could enter. Armand woke to the noise outside his door, clutching his aching head, thinking that the same thing had happened again. He gave Richard permission to enter. He looked at the blanket covering him, finding its oddly lumpy shape peculiar. He sat up and dressed, staring in shock at Rosetta, sleeping soundly with her hands folded on his bare chest. Richard announced his entry, and the man frantically try to understand what had happened. He continued to stare at the girl, sleeping peacefully on top of him, wondering why she was there. The bedchamber door began to open, and his heart pounded in his chest. Richard, seeing the prince's bed, expressed surprise that he hadn't yet risen, and asked with concern if Armand was all right. The man shifted under the blankets, murmuring that he was just feeling unwell. Richard solicitously suggested summoning a priest. However, a muffled voice from beneath the blankets protested, saying it wasn't that serious and there was no need to call anyone. One hand gripped the blanket, the other covered the sleeping girl's head. Rosetta awoke, opening one eye and groaning sleepily. Lying opposite her was the handsome Armand, his shirt open and unrestrained. Rosetta froze in shock, the reality of the situation hitting her as she recalled the previous night's events. Richard stared in bewilderment at the strange movements beneath the blanket. While covering the girl's mouth, he answered Richard's renewed inquiry about his well-being, claiming he was fine and just stretching. Rosetta, her mouth muffled by the prince's hand, wondered if she was going mad as she listened to Richard's surprise comment about his stretching under the covers. Meanwhile, Armand, without releasing his grip, ordered Richard to get to the point and tell him what he needed. Rosetta was still astonished that she had fallen asleep in the prince's bed. Pressed close together, they began to listen to Richard's report. Watching the pulse in Armand's neck as Richard recounted the discovery of an intruder during the night and the subsequent investigation, Rosetta felt like she was losing her mind. The man's only fear was that Rosetta would hear his racing heart. One part of him wanted to move away from her, the other to pull her closer. He looked at the girl, thinking that if it were any other maid, he would have thrown her out and punished her. But for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Until this moment, everything had been completely different. Before, looking at her, he felt guilt, but now, an indescribable emotion surged within him. Whenever she was near, his body tensed involuntarily. This feeling was definitely more than just guilt. He had to admit it. He, Armand, prince of the Ragnar Empire, had fallen for this strange maid, Rosetta. Strange movements began again under the blanket. Richard, awkwardly holding a parchment, called to the prince. Armand closed his eyes, tried to compose himself, and told Richard once more that he wasn't feeling well. From within the large lump under the blanket, Armand's muffled voice asked Richard how much longer he intended to torture him. Richard, nearly in tears with frustration, begged Armand's forgiveness. Hidden beneath the blankets, Armand felt his head swimming. Richard finally announced his departure. Rosetta watched Armand's displeasure as the door closed behind Richard. Armand immediately threw back the blankets and moved sharply away from Rosetta. Rosetta, bewildered, asked why he was angry with poor Richard. The prince snapped at her, demanding to know why she was there. The girl put a finger to her lips, urging him to be quiet then. She explained that it wasn't what he thought at all. She had simply helped ease his nighttime affliction and had happened to fall asleep. The man, surprised by her words, questioned her again. He was astonished that she had managed it. Rosetta told him she had simply spoken to him, and he had gradually calmed down. The girl turned and smiled faintly. What she had done seemed more like training. The shocked Armand couldn't help but wonder if his feelings for Rosetta had influenced it, because no matter how many priests had tried, none had succeeded. Rosetta turned to the prince, who thanked her, saying it was all thanks to her. The two sat on the bed, gazing at each other. Rosetta immediately denied any credit. Rosetta said she had only wanted to help him. Armand replied that it must have been difficult. Rosetta agreed, coughing and covering her mouth with her fist, adding that he was very assertive. Armand closed his eyes, saying he knew he became stronger at those times. They fell silent, lost in their own thoughts. Rosetta mused that he was very confident in her, though not without reason. Armand had always known she was stronger than most men. Armand interrupted her thoughts, reminding her that today she had a wish she wanted him to grant. The girl immediately swung her legs off the bed, preparing to go somewhere. With her hands clasped behind her back, she said she wanted to go to the library with him. When the prince offered her his pass, she explained that the point was to go together. Their thoughts were once again completely different. The man assumed Rosetta wanted a date, while Rosetta felt it would make it easier to protect him. Walking side by side into the library, Rosetta said she wanted to find something to read. Armand smiled, watching the girl look around, wondering how to impress her. On their date, he chuckled inwardly, never thinking he'd regret rejecting all those women. Armand walked towards her without hesitation. He reached over her head, standing close, offering to help, as he knew the location of almost every book. Rosetta froze, feeling Armand's closeness, wondering why he was standing so near. Nearby maids had gathered, whispering amongst themselves. Rosetta turned to Armand, saying she was looking for a book on taming cats and had already found it. Armand asked, surprised, if she had a cat. The girl laughed, recalling the prince's behavior the previous night, and said she had indeed recently begun caring for one. The girl handed the book to the prince, saying she wanted to take it back and study it carefully. Hiding her face behind the book, thinking the gossip wouldn't die down anytime soon, she failed to notice the obstacle in front of her. Bumping into someone, the girl looked up apologetically. At that moment, she recognized the person, Valerian. Surprised, she asked him what he was doing there. The man extended his hand to her, saying he had come specifically to see her. Taking his hand, she asked, surprised, how he knew she would be there. He gave a cryptic reply, saying he had his ways. The man pulled her closer, looking at her face and asking why she was so flushed. Remembering Armand leaning close while helping her with the book, she replied that it was a bit warm. Valerian looked ahead, pointing, and teasingly asked if it was because of him that she was blushing. Rosetta, seeing the prince looking for her, shivered, wondering if he had followed her. The girl hid behind Valerian, urging him to quickly hide her. The man, amused, agreed. Armand called out her name. However, the corridor was empty. No one answered his call. The man looked down, realizing she was gone. The girl, cloaked, stood in the library corridor. Armand, not seeing her, turned and left. Valerian put his arm around her waist, enveloping her in his cloak, a magical light flickering around them. Rosetta thought about Armand. They hadn't been particularly close before, so why did she feel so strange now? Valerian was also thinking about the girl. Lately, she had become like a stranger to him. He looked at her, once again noticing her long eyelashes and deep blue eyes. Rosetta might have been reborn, but she was only 20 now, the age when most young ladies began to interact with men. She looked up at him and asked if the cloak was magical. Valerian nodded, confirming it and adding that it could also muffle sound. She looked around, saying they needed more quiet. He told her to take something. Turning, Rosetta saw him offering her a square, red box. Inside were 2 exquisite cufflinks. Picking one up, she sensed a magical aura. A powerful spell had been cast upon them. Valerian explained that the cufflinks were a gift for the prince. He said that if the prince were ever in danger, the magic on the cufflinks would instantly transport him to the prince's side. Rosetta was surprised. Valerian chuckled, saying he simply thought the girl, busy protecting the prince, wouldn't have time to see him. He then handed her a pendant, similar to the cufflinks, explaining it was linked to them. Looking at the pendant in her hand, Rosetta heard him say that a maid wearing expensive jewelry would attract attention, so he had made the pendant appear to be fake. Despite this, Valerian added it still suited her. Rosetta agreed that he had made an excellent choice. Rosetta looked at the jewelry in her hands. The pieces looked like accessories exchanged between lovers. She thanked Valerian and said goodbye, explaining she needed to see the prince. His cloak billowed slightly as he stopped her, asking her to wait. He approached her and took her hand, saying he wanted to help her put on the pendant. Rosetta was a little surprised, as she could do it herself. He wondered if she did this often. She agreed and handed him the pendant. Rosetta turned, brushing her hair to the side. He leaned down and fastened the pendant around her neck. Suddenly, he asked if she had told the prince she wasn't actually dying. Rosetta replied that she hadn't, but she would tell him someday. Valerian asked if there was anything else he could do for her. Rosetta asked him to accompany her to buy clothes on the weekend. He agreed to wait for her. Watching her leave, Armand was still in the library, standing discontentedly between the bookshelves, the maids observing him. He turned and saw her, his expression brightening. Armand was momentarily speechless, then blurted out, asking why she had left without saying anything. Touching her face, she apologized with a smile, explaining that time had flown by while chatting with a friend. Still disgruntled, Armand pressed on, asking if she knew how worried he had been, but then fell silent, simply staring at her. He sighed softly and lowered his head. She looked at him with concern, asking if he had been worried about her. He answered with a short yes. Looking into her eyes, he admitted he had been very worried and told her not to leave without permission again. She looked at him in surprise, unexpected by his words. She felt he was being particularly attentive to her today. She guessed it might be due to guilt. Remembering the cufflinks, she told Armand she had something for him. He looked at the cufflinks in his palm, surprised by the gift. He couldn't understand how she could afford something so expensive on a maid's salary. He asked if she had bought them, then fell silent again. Rosetta watched him, waiting for him to say something more. He could hardly believe his suspicion. Rosetta wanted to wear matching accessories. She had clearly bought jewelry that a maid's salary could barely cover. Armand couldn't even scold her, nor could he say something like, there was no need to go to such lengths. Agitated by the prolonged silence, she softly called his name. Still holding the cufflinks, Armand thanked her. He clutched the gift tightly to his chest, promising to wear them every day. Touched by his reaction, Rosetta felt her gift was truly cherished. He said he had nothing to give her in return. She reassured him that she didn't expect anything. Armand declared that wouldn't do. His personality wouldn't allow him to be indebted to anyone. Surprised, she whispered, asking if he wanted to give her something back. Noticing she didn't have many clothes, he decided to call a tailor to make her new ones. Rosetta immediately waved her hands in refusal, explaining that a friend would accompany her to buy new clothes on the weekend. Armand immediately asked who this friend was. Rosetta smiled and admitted that it was her close childhood friend. The man nodded understandingly, saying that girls all love to shop. Rosetta immediately corrected him. She calmly stated that her friend was a man, not a woman. Armand froze, completely taken aback by this revelation. After composing himself, he expressed surprise that a man would be helping her choose clothes. She replied that her friend was more fashion conscious than some women and that he would definitely help her pick out the perfect outfit. Armand, extremely annoyed, immediately ordered her to cancel the meeting. Rosetta, surprised again, asked why he was reacting this way. Armand declared that he would personally take her to a boutique, as no gift was better than clothes. Rosetta still couldn't understand his sudden decision. With a darkened expression, the prince asked if she doubted his taste or if she thought her friend's taste was superior. Rosetta immediately denied it. He turned to leave, saying they would depart the following afternoon. Rosetta, still bewildered, remained puzzled by his behavior. The man and woman sat facing each other in the carriage, enveloped in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The girl wondered why things like this always seemed to happen in this lifetime. After much contemplation, she finally felt at peace. Since she was already out, she decided to enjoy the opportunity. Rosetta resolved to have a wonderful time with Valerian on her day off. The girl gazed out the window, absorbed in her thoughts, while the man watched her intently, his mind a tempest of unsettling thoughts. He thought about her sudden disappearance during their date and her weekend plans with another man. Were they really so close that they would even go into a fitting room together? He grew suspicious, wondering who else would be in a fitting room besides engaged or married couples. Armand couldn't believe he was jealous. He pondered whether she had enjoyed their date, reassuring himself that he would make it up to her tomorrow. As the carriage continued its journey, he desperately questioned himself, wondering if she liked being with him. Did she even like him at all? Rosetta was relaxed and didn't need to make special preparations, so she had plenty of time before meeting the prince. She decided to arrive early and wait. However, on her way, she encountered Melanie. Melanie asked her to wait, approaching with an angry expression, clearly upset about something. She rushed up to Rosetta, demanding to know if she was really going to wear that. Rosetta explained that the prince simply wanted to thank her for her help. Melanie exclaimed that it was clearly a date, since he was also buying her clothes. Rosetta insisted that the prince didn't care what she wore, but Melanie stubbornly declared that she couldn't embarrass the royal family in front of His Highness. Rosetta hesitated, asking if that was true. Melanie grabbed Rosetta's hand, urging her to hurry up. Rosetta tried to stop her, but Melanie told her not to ask any questions. Melanie said she had prepared many things for Rosetta. Looking at the girl in the beautiful dress, Melanie thought about her own matters. Rosetta always looked beautiful, no matter what she wore. It didn't matter to her. Despite her noble background, she was always approachable and cheerful, dressing simply and easily getting along with the other maids. For someone truly loyal to the royal family, she was quite special, and that was precisely why Melanie liked her. Melanie gazed admiringly at Rosetta's beauty, silently wishing her a safe journey as she watched her leave. Armand was already waiting by the carriage, nervously anticipating the girl's arrival. He was so anxious that he didn't see her until she greeted him. Looking up, he was stunned by her beauty. Armand had always known the maid was beautiful. The man's face remained expressionless, but a blush crept up his cheeks. She hadn't been this beautiful when they first met, but with the new clothes and makeup, everything had changed. Now, every time he looked at her, he couldn't tear his eyes away. He wondered when she had become so special to him. The prince nervously cleared his throat, and Rosetta immediately expressed concern for his health. He reassured her that he was fine. Rosetta looked at him in surprise as he extended his hand towards her. Armand wanted to help Rosetta into the carriage, ordering her to give him her hand. The girl stood still, unable to move. The prince waited for her, and she couldn't believe His Highness was accompanying her. In her mind, she should be the one helping him, not the other way around. Rosetta was so embarrassed she couldn't control herself, and her hand trembled involuntarily. The prince immediately noticed her state, wondering if she was nervous because this was a real date. The carriage started moving, and Rosetta asked him where they were going. He replied that he was taking her to a famous clothing store to buy her some clothes. Surprised, she asked again where they were going. She knew it was the most popular boutique in the entire empire. It was a spacious and bright 4-story building with a wide variety of clothing, patronized even by the empress and the upper nobility. Unfortunately for her, that was the extent of her knowledge of fashionable clothing. Rosetta tried to refuse the trip, saying she didn't need such expensive clothes and that in such a boutique, an appointment was probably necessary. Armand noticed that Rosetta sometimes forgot who he was. The girl looked at him, not understanding what he meant. The carriage stopped, and a girl in beautiful shoes stepped down. The man and the girl entered the magnificent shop together, and a woman immediately came forward to greet His Highness. Rosetta looked around in awe, amazed by the beauty of the store. She didn't notice the owner had walked up to the prince. The woman introduced herself as Lydia, stating it was an honor to welcome him to her boutique, and inquired whom he was choosing clothes for. The prince ignored her words and, without changing his posture, simply said the clothes were for his maid. Lydia was very surprised, wondering how a maid could afford such things. Meanwhile, Rosetta was looking at a dress, thinking about how nice the fabric was. At the same time, the prince told the owner that the price didn't matter and that he needed her help in choosing 10 outfits for the girl. Rosetta complained that 10 was too many, but the prince pretended not to hear, saying he would wait while she chose. Although unhappy, the girl silently accepted. Lydia handed her a catalog, saying she could see all the dresses in the store there. The girl flipped through the catalog and sighed, not understanding why the prince was so particular. Looking at the pictures of the dresses, she felt the current fashion was too flashy for her. Of course, this boutique was the most popular now, but soon fashion would change, and simpler clothing would be appreciated. By then, the popularity of this store would also fade. Among all the dresses, she chose the blue one, feeling it was the most suitable for her, and asked the owner if she could try it on. Lydia said there was no need to rush and that she could think about it some more. Rosetta replied that she wasn't in a hurry, smiling as she admitted she wasn't really interested in fashion. Lydia took back the catalog and turned away, displeased, thinking Rosetta was arrogant. Holding the blue dress, she thought if she sent her away vaguely, perhaps everything would be resolved. The girl would probably understand and leave the boutique immediately. Rosetta stood in the fitting room, waiting for the dress to be brought to her. Suddenly, the owner pulled back the curtain. Rosetta stood there, covering her face with her hands, as Lydia spoke to her. Lydia said there had been a misunderstanding, and the other customers behind her were laughing and looking at the girl. Lydia said the dress had been reserved by someone else, and she needed to take it back. Rosetta didn't understand why she was saying this while she was changing. The girl suddenly realized that this boutique was for nobles, and ordinary maids like her were not welcome. Unable to tell this to the crown prince, she chose to humiliate the girl. Walking out of the fitting room without a trace of shame, Rosetta asked the owner, "Can you really blame your mistakes on your customers?" She turned to the owner and said she just wanted to buy a dress, but had encountered so much trouble. She added with a laugh that perhaps other ladies of higher status would encounter even bigger problems here. Lydia said she understood the girl's disappointment at not being able to buy the dress she liked, but asked her not to be rude. She didn't understand Rosetta's identity and asked her to behave appropriately. Rosetta said Lydia was right. The dress wasn't suitable for her anyway. However, she still demanded an apology from the owner for barging into the fitting room without permission and for expecting Rosetta to overlook her mistake with the dress. Rosetta stated that nobles should indeed maintain their dignity. Lydia looked at the girl with impatience, thinking she was just an ordinary maid. Noticing they weren't going to apologize, Rosetta decided to leave. Just then, their conversation was interrupted by a girl in a blue dress who told them to stop. With a faint smile, the girl approached Rosetta and asked if she was planning to take her dress. The girl scoffed, saying that such a dress should be worn to the emperor's ball, not for doing laundry. With that, she stepped closer and slapped Rosetta. The girl continued to taunt Rosetta, telling her to know her place, because judging by her shabby, cheap clothes, she didn't belong here. Rosetta smiled faintly, thinking she needed to teach someone a lesson. However, before she could act, a man's voice suddenly rang out, asking if she was just a worthless maid. Armand, having heard everything, was walking up the stairs. The girl, who had been so bold just moments before, froze when she realized who was behind her. The prince demanded to know how they dared speak about his protege that way. Rosetta was surprised. She didn't understand why he was here. The girl immediately became nervous, saying men weren't supposed to be here. Rosetta said it was nothing, she was fine. Armand impatiently asked the girl if those were the only words she knew. Was she truly all right? He approached Rosetta, asking if she had nothing to say after hearing such nonsense. He said even if she was fine, he wasn't. Rosetta was once again stunned by his words. Then she smiled slyly and addressed him. The girl pleaded with the prince to leave, saying she knew this boutique better than he did. She urged him to go, knowing that if he wasn't stopped, the trouble and gossip would be endless. Fortunately, the prince agreed to do as she said. He gave her a small smile, then turned a dark gaze towards the owner. He said he wouldn't forget, pointing at the owner and the girl. He said he wouldn't forget what happened today. As he left the boutique, the prince slammed the door shut. Lydia and the girl sat down on the floor, tense, realizing how things had ended. The carriage continued on its way. Looking out the window, the girl thought that 10 custom-made dresses wouldn't be expensive for His Highness. Yet she was still just an ordinary maid. He was so good to her, was it only out of pity? She wondered if she told him she wasn't dying. Would he look at her and be overjoyed? The girl lowered her head, apologizing for making him worry. However, the prince immediately interrupted her, saying he didn't want to hear it. He asked her why she was apologizing. Rosetta was surprised and asked him what he meant. He said it wasn't her fault, and he didn't understand why she was apologizing. If he was upset, Rosetta was left speechless more than once today. The carriage continued on its way. The prince told her that if she didn't like him worrying about her, then she needed to be kinder to herself. He went on to say that she shouldn't be treated this way, and he hoped she wouldn't tolerate such behavior from anyone again. The carriage finally stopped. The girl stared at the prince with her mouth slightly agape, scarcely able to believe his words. The girl nodded in agreement and thanked him. The prince said that if she was apologizing for making him upset, then she was truly kind. She said she wasn't that kind, but he disagreed, saying she was more worried about him than herself. The girl laughed and said that was because he was her master. Armand was taken aback by this. However, the girl continued, saying she would only be like this with him. At that moment, the prince suddenly understood. If this were a novel for girls, even a passing reader, even a bird flying by, would understand the meaning of this scene. Her words were clearly a confession. Only the girl herself hadn't realized it. Armand thought he was prepared, but this sudden confession still caught him off guard. He recalled something that had happened to him a long time ago. A young boy stood before his mother's grave, surrounded by indifferent people who had no desire to comfort him. Raindrops fell on his mother's burial site. There was only silence and loneliness. He didn't understand how much courage it took to give one's heart to someone who was about to leave. A heavy silence fell over the carriage once more. To break the silence, Rosetta said she wouldn't let the incident at the boutique go. Armand assumed she was changing the subject, as he didn't respond, but he asked what she planned to do. Rosetta smiled and gestured with her finger, saying she just needed a little help from him. She turned down a side street, Armand following in her footsteps. Rosetta turned to Armand, saying they had arrived, and this was the very shop she had in mind. Armand expressed surprise at her choice of shop. Rosetta asked if he knew why noble ladies fought so fiercely over dresses. She explained that there was a ball at the palace in 2 weeks. And, as he probably knew, it was the last chance to secure a dance partner before the hunting festival. Rosetta told him she intended to buy the most beautiful, exquisite dress from this shop, and he would then gift it to the lady who would accompany him to the ball. Ideally, it would be the perfect way to mortify the girl who had slapped her. The blue dress she had admired so much would be the best choice. Armand looked at the shop, surprised that securing a partner for the hunting festival involved this. A woman appeared at the doorway, asking if they were here for a dress. Rosetta replied that yes, she wanted to have one made. The owner asked if they knew the measurements of the lady who would wear the dress. Armand looked at Rosetta and asked, wasn't it obvious? Rosetta was silent again, confused by his response. In previous lives, Armand had always attended balls with Lanella. Although she worried about future changes because of the blue dress, his dance partner hadn't changed, so everything was fine. Armand asked again, wasn't it obvious who the dress was for? Seeing no one understood, he pointed at Rosetta, making it clear the dress should be made to her measurements. Rosetta was surprised, realizing the dress truly was for her. She sighed, a thought suddenly occurring to her. Of course, His Highness probably knew nothing about ladies' dress sizes, so the dress would be made to her measurements first, and then adjusted if needed. The owner led them inside, and Rosetta asked if she could make the dress a little larger to allow for alterations later. Armand watched the women, puzzled by the need for adjustments. The naive man assumed Rosetta was anticipating further growth and therefore want a larger size. Leaving the shop, Rosetta thanked the owner again, expressing her trust in her work. Approaching the carriage, Armand commented that since they only bought one dress, they had a lot of free time now. Rosetta replied that this was just an unexpected situation. Sitting in the carriage, Rosetta told Armand she had truly enjoyed their outing. She confessed it would become one of her most cherished memories and thanked him for such a wonderful day. Armand remained silent. Hearing nothing, Rosetta said she hoped to repay him for the rest of the day if he would allow it. Armand asked what she meant. Rosetta replied it would only take an hour or two if he agreed. She leaned closer and asked him to take off his clothes. Armand froze, completely taken aback by the request. Rosetta told him not to be stubborn and to hurry up and undress, as she would bring him other clothes. Armand remained seated in the carriage, his mind blank. After a moment, he raised his hand and unbuttoned his collar. As his fingers touched the buttons on his chest, he thought being forced to undress in a carriage was a rather peculiar hobby of hers. Just then, Rosetta's voice called from outside, asking if he was finished. Rosetta entered the carriage and handed him some clothes, explaining they were peasant clothes and he should change quickly. Armand still didn't understand why, and Rosetta told him the night market was opening tonight. She said they might encounter robbers and thieves, but the kebabs there were delicious. Armand gave a nervous laugh. Rosetta and Armand walked through the night market dressed as peasants. All the girls around turned to look at Armand in his peasant attire. He wondered why everyone was staring, and Rosetta commented that it wasn't just blue-eyed, blonde men who were attractive. She suggested he cover his face with his hood. Rosetta instantly thought of Valerian, realizing this was the type of man she was drawn to. Suddenly, a girl's hand appeared in front of Armand, holding a skewer of grilled meat, offering him a taste. He turned to look at her. She already had 3 skewers in her hand, one of which she offered him. Armand opened his mouth and tasted the proffered delicacy. Rosetta watched him closely, waiting for his reaction. He chewed, declaring it delicious. The girl smiled and offered him more. He asked why she wasn't eating any herself. She said she was fine. Just then, Armand's hand reached out and gently pinched her cheek. Surprised, she asked him what he was doing. He replied that from now on, every time she said she was fine, he would do that. Rosetta hadn't expected this playful gesture, remarking to herself that he must have just thought of it. The girl ran excitedly through the night market streets, looking at all the things for sale. Armand watched her reaction, smiling softly. He noticed the air getting colder and suggested they find somewhere to go, but the girl pointed out there would be fireworks after dark. Armand said he would get her a cloak and told her to wait there. The girl started to say she was fine, but remembering his promise, she remained silent. He told her again to wait for him there. The girl sat quietly on a bench, gazing at the beautiful night sky she hadn't seen in a long time. Suddenly, 2 men walked by and greeted her. As they approached, they invited her to watch the fireworks with them, if she was alone. She was about to say she had company when one of the men interrupted, saying he had a great offer and that she needn't mention her companion again. He continued, saying their companionship only required what she already possessed. He leaned closer to her, waiting for her reaction. The girl thought to herself that she had hoped for a peaceful day. She asked them loudly if they expected her to pay for a date. Rosetta was glad they'd appeared while Armand was away. Without hesitation, the girl spun around and kicked the stranger in the chest with her slender leg, sending his head snapping back. She thought gleefully that she could finally show off her skills without restraint and tell them their money wasn't nearly enough. She turned to the second man and told him to hurry up, as she had to deal with them before her companion returned. With one stranger already on the ground, Rosetta prepared to face the second. The man yelled angrily, He lunged at her, shouting that he would teach her a lesson. The girl calmly waited for him to get closer. Rosetta smiled, pleased that everything was going as planned. As the man charged, she grabbed his arm, preventing him from touching her. Then, tightening her grip, she flipped him over her shoulder, slamming him head first into the ground. He lay there, completely incapacitated. In the setting sun, the beautiful girl stood, her gaze fixed on the distance. The man on the ground cried out, calling her a monster. The girl sat on him cheerfully, remarking that she hadn't heard anyone call her that in a long time. Meanwhile, Armand was returning with the cloak, thinking to himself that he didn't know the way back and wondering why he had so confidently promised to return. The girl, still sitting on the man, pondered what to do with them, oblivious to Armand approaching from behind. He called out Rosetta's name. Embarrassed, she stood up, nervously wondering what to do. Armand's jaw dropped as he stared, asking what had happened. The girl gasped, extremely nervous, sweat trickling down her face. He looked at her and asked what had happened and if she was hurt. She ran to his side and said a gentleman had helped her. He asked who this gentleman was. She described him as handsome as a knight, with blue eyes and blonde hair. Armand was displeased by this description, but said he was glad she wasn't hurt. He thought to himself, could a blue-eyed, blonde-haired knight have really appeared and saved her? Her description seemed familiar. Did he know this knight? Could it be that friend? The one who worked at the palace. He disliked this friend of hers intensely and wondered if she was trying to hide something, though that would be foolish and absurd. Lost in thought, he was startled when Rosetta told him to look. He looked up and saw brilliant fireworks exploding before him. Standing almost shoulder to shoulder, they looked up at the night sky, admiring the fireworks. Gazing at the beautiful display, she exclaimed how magnificent it was. She turned to the prince and asked him if the view was beautiful. The man looked at the girl and the fireworks behind her, saying that everything was beautiful. Later that night, they returned to the castle. The girl frowned unhappily, turning her face away from the man. Rosetta leaned against the wall of her room, cursing the prince. She wondered if another episode had just occurred and if it was really related to the boutique incident. Rosetta was glad she was now prepared for this kind of situation. The prince pressed close to the girl, who was holding the book 100 Ways to Tame a Naughty Cat, thinking about putting the advice into practice. The man growled softly in the girl's ear, seeing that she ignored him. The girl pursed her lips in displeasure at his actions. The girl told the prince no, because it was important to first make it clear which behaviors were unacceptable. The man moved away from the girl, and Rosetta wondered if this method of arguing was actually effective. Looking at the book, the girl wondered if everything would really go smoothly. It seemed like everything was going according to plan, but another thought popped into her head. It was very possible that the prince still remembered everything that happened during his episodes. Perhaps he remembered her telling him no last night. The second rule was to give appropriate rewards to make training easier. The girl showed the man some delicious beef jerky. Armand, the crown prince of the Ragnar Empire, looked at the girl in confusion. Rosetta suddenly realized that cat treats wouldn't work here. At that moment, the girl suddenly realized that she didn't actually know what His Highness liked. She looked at the book, thinking about what to use as a substitute for the jerky. The third piece of advice was to pet the cat in its favorite spots, so that it would get used to being touched. The girl looked at the prince, thinking about where would be appropriate. Rosetta remembered that her cat liked to have its tail stroked, but she was too nervous to do the same to His Highness. Rosetta was so nervous, she felt like she was going crazy. She approached the prince and asked him if he trusted her. The man growled, and the girl held out her hand, saying she wouldn't hurt him. She brought her hand to his hair, thinking she should start with his head. She placed her fingers behind the prince's ear and gently stroked his hair. After a while, she decided to try somewhere else. The girl placed her hand on the prince's bare chest. Rosetta hesitated whether to leave her hand where it was or move it lower. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by the man. He grabbed the hand that was touching him, refusing to let go, and pressed closer to the girl, pinning her against the wall. The man growled, his emotions complex and difficult to understand. Rosetta nervously said he was a good boy and liked being petted. Then, the man did something that shocked the girl even more. He answered her no. The girl was stunned that the prince could speak during an episode. However, the man continued, saying he preferred something else. He wrapped one arm around the girl's waist and the other around the back of her head, preventing her from turning away, and kissed her deeply. His lips continued to kiss hers. The girl, her cheeks flushed, regained some of her senses and asked His Highness to wait. But he didn't hear her, and she pushed him away with her hands. The girl pondered why he had suddenly kissed her, feeling that he was completely lucid. Because he had spoken. She looked at His Highness and asked if he knew who she was. The man looked at the girl, smiled happily, and said she was Rose. The girl pressed her hand to her chest in surprise. He had called her name. Could it be that because of the medicine, his senses were starting to return? The girl thought, feeling her heart beat faster. The man looked at her silently, his gaze never leaving her. He still hadn't fully regained his senses. She looked at the man and sternly told him that it was very rude to kiss someone without permission and not to do it again, asking if he understood. The man immediately replied, saying no, he wanted more. Rosetta was confused by this response. Tired of these thoughts, she decided to stop for the day, telling the prince that she thought it was time for bed. However, the man leaned down, cupped the girl's face, said no, he wanted more, and then moved closer to her face again. This time he tried to kiss her, and Rosetta finally put her hand between their lips. The girl told him that if he was a good boy, he should listen and go to sleep. However, looking at his face, I knew he obviously wouldn't. Was there really no way to force him, I wondered. Convincing herself it was just an experiment, the girl lay down on the bed and called for the prince. She promised him a kiss. Armand watched her, realizing what she had said. Meanwhile, Rosetta called him over again. He chuckled, pleased, now close to what he wanted. I'll put my palms on the bed, he replied. He lay on the bed opposite her, reaching out to her, requesting a kiss. Her heart raced, her cheeks flushed. She hadn't expected it to actually work. He stretched out beside her, his thumb lightly brushing her lips. The clock chimed, snapping her out of her daze. She agreed. She couldn't refuse. A knight never goes back on their word. Rosetta pushed him onto the bed, holding his shoulders down, thinking that he only needed one kiss. Slowly, she brought her lips close to his. Then, she quickly kissed him, asking if that was enough. Satisfied, she told him she had done as he wished, and now it was his turn to go to sleep. However, he stopped her, grabbing her wrist. Rosetta looked around, letting out a nervous sigh. He pushed her onto the bed, looking directly into her eyes. Without giving her a chance to speak, he returned the kiss. The fire in the fireplace roared. Their hands intertwined, fingers laced together. Rosetta begged him to stop, pleaded with him to cease. She lay there, pushing his head away. She thought he was so shocked that he'd lost consciousness. Lying beneath him, she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. Early morning, the sounds of activity echoed through the castle. Rosetta moved among the other servants, thinking that she could no longer look Armand in the eye. Her hands rested on the door to his chambers, her heart filled with shame. She took a deep breath, preparing to enter. Stepping inside, she greeted him with a good morning. He stood by the window, not looking at her, and began to talk about last night. He turned slightly towards her, asking if he had lost control again last night. She looked at him, considering how to respond. He turned fully to face her, looking at her and asking for forgiveness. Rosetta quickly waved her hands, saying he had nothing to apologize for. Last night, he was even better. He even spoke. Surprised that he had spoken, he rushed towards her, loudly asking what he had said. She fell silent, embarrassed, recalling the kiss from last night. She said he had expressed liking something. He took another step closer. He asked her what he liked. She closed her eyes, unable to admit he'd said he liked kissing her. Looking directly into his eyes, she answered shortly, or rather, my body. She thought to herself, Rosetta said he liked her. She didn't look away, waiting for his reaction. They stood close together. He asked again. He was shocked, incredulous. Blushing, he couldn't believe he had revealed his feelings to Rosetta. Looking at her, he couldn't believe he had done such a thing. She then said he hadn't said anything else. Hearing this, Armand blushed even deeper, coughing nervously. She quickly responded, saying he should go see the priest and have him check if everything was all right. He noticed her reaction, realizing she was uneasy and not at all happy about his confession. She nervously continued, saying he looked tired and could rest. She would come back later. He told her to forget what he had said to her and to go rest. Watching the door close behind her, he thought it was for the best. It was good that she had rejected him. Loving someone who didn't have much time left in this world was difficult. A woman's hands rested on his shoulders, a voice saying, This is truly heartbreaking. The woman embraced the boy standing before the grave, murmuring that he understood. He was a smart boy. She whispered in his ear, "Now you understand how painful it is to lose someone, how heavy your heart feels when you can't have what you want." The woman tried to persuade the boy, standing in the crowd, to remember these feelings. And now, I embrace the weeping man, telling him he doesn't need these foolish dreams. Theodore smiled and greeted Rosetta, saying she was right on time. Rosetta thanked him for making time for her despite his busy schedule. He offered her a seat and said he would examine her here. Theodore's hands glowed with magic as he examined her. Rosetta had expected him to ask about her feelings first. She guessed that Armand was still in shock after yesterday's conversation, and his condition was worsening. Perhaps Theodore should become his personal physician. Theodore froze, staring at her, his hands gripping hers tightly. He exclaimed that she had been purified, calling it an unbelievable miracle. He said it was a miraculous event that must be recorded and reported to Armand. Rosetta urged him to calm down. She knew there would be a strong reaction, but not this intense. She began to speak of how highly Armand regarded his abilities and asked him to convey her well wishes. But she had forgotten to do so earlier. Theodore was stunned. Rosetta continued, saying that Armand believed Theodore would find a solution. Theodore clenched his fists, struggling to control his emotions, barely able to believe what he was hearing. He laughed joyfully, tears in his eyes, asking if it was truly so. Rosetta was surprised he was so happy about this. He quickly composed himself, saying there was something else about her that concerned him. There is a significant amount of magic around her heart, which seemed to be the reason for her recovery. Rosetta thought Theodore was a good person. She had also felt her own awakening accelerating recently. He held her hand, saying he was glad she was healthy and he wouldn't have to worry about her anymore. Sitting in the carriage, Rosetta thought this was wonderful. Her father probably wouldn't be happy about her miraculous recovery unless she became a knight. He didn't care much for her otherwise. He probably wouldn't have been saddened by news of her death either. She continued to think as she rode, realizing she just needed to tell Armand. Rosetta blushed and smiled, thinking of Armand. He would be so happy. Arriving at the castle, she immediately went to his room, announcing her arrival with a smile. She asked how he was feeling, if he was any better. He simply replied, "Good," but she felt that wasn't the case. He was cold today. He asked what had happened and told her to take the day off. Rosetta looked at him, confused, unsure what was wrong. She decided to tell him the news when he was in a better mood. She said it was nothing. He looked up at her quizzically, then smiled and gave her a thumbs up. Rosetta said she just wanted to take another day off for the weekend. He thought silently, remembering she had mentioned a friend the last time she took a holiday. He asked with a wry smile if she was taking the day off to see that friend. Rosetta laughed happily. How'd he guess? She was indeed going to see him. Armand was surprised by her candor. As she was leaving, she made one more request, that he not remove the gift she had given him, even when she wasn't around. He clenched his fist. The cufflinks were fastened to his shirt. Thinking about the phrase, even when she wasn't around, he agreed. Rosetta stood at the door, thanking him and saying goodbye. But Armand told her to wait, abruptly standing up from his chair. He wondered what she was trying to say. Did she still have feelings for him? However, he immediately froze, remembering something. Rosetta smiled and said she was fine, urging him not to overthink it. Maybe she wouldn't die after all. Armand thought the poor girl was still clinging to the hope of recovery. Rosetta looked at the pendant, thinking about spending the weekend with Valerian. She felt he always worried when she wasn't around. She was also worried about Armand's condition. Finally, the weekend arrived. She called out for Valerian. Dressed in a beautiful dress, Rosetta called out to him, announcing her arrival. She pushed open the door, only to be met with silence. She wondered what had happened. Where was Valerian? She sighed. Rosetta figured Valerian was probably playing hide-and-seek. She ran around the room, calling out to him, telling him to stop messing around. She walked to the wardrobe. It was the only place left to check. He loved hiding there as a child. Rosetta reached out to open the wardrobe door. Suddenly, a man's hand reached out from the wardrobe, grabbing her wrist. Rosetta was startled, momentarily frozen in surprise. A man's hand abruptly pulled the girl into the wardrobe. It all happened so fast. The wardrobe door closed in front of him, and she was gone. The man kissed the girl's palm and gazed into her eyes. "You're as beautiful as ever this morning," he said. Rosetta yanked her hand back, furious. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Getting to her feet, she asked in astonishment, "Did you actually create a portal to your house inside the royal palace?" Valerian smiled. "No one knows about it," he replied, "and even if they did, they wouldn't dare tell." He paused, then asked, "Why are you dressed like this to see me?" Before she could answer, he continued, "That's a beautiful dress. I like it very much." Rosetta felt a pang of awkwardness. She wondered if Valerian would be angry if she admitted the prince had bought it for her. Quickly changing the subject, she asked, "How's the poison detector coming along?" "A few more days," he replied. "It's still in the experimental stage." Rosetta took his hand. "You're doing great, Valerian," she said. "Can you define curse for me?" Rosetta asked. Valerian looked surprised. "Do you really think the headmaster has been cursed?" "It's just a guess," she admitted. "I really think someone cursed him. Of course, it would be easier to believe he's just gone mad, but I can't tell anyone this secret. First, we need to figure out how the curse was cast," Valerian said. "After all, the most powerful curses are usually the oldest." Rosetta fell into thought. "Thank you," she said. "I'll look into it." Valerian placed a hand on her shoulder. "We should rest," he said. "Let's not talk about work anymore." As he began to cast a spell, he said, "I want to take you somewhere. I think it will cheer you up." Rosetta looked at him. "Where are we going?" "Anywhere you want," he said, opening a portal. "I'll go anywhere with you." He scooped her up and rushed through the open portal. Rosetta looked at him, remembering his playful nature. He was only 22, after all. "Stop!" she cried, exhilarated. "I'm going to be sick." Rosetta continued to scream, thinking he was acting like a child. She was almost losing consciousness. She hated portals. "Open your eyes," he said. "We're here." He placed his hands on her shoulders and turned her around. "Look." Enclosed in a bubble of air, they were underwater, surrounded by swimming fish. Rosetta stared in wonder at the fish darting around them. "The ocean is the best place to cleanse the soul," he said. "Magicians can do anything," Rosetta murmured. "Since you decided to bring me here," she added, "what do you want in return?" He silently pointed to his cheek. They stood quietly in the water, him waiting for her reaction. Before she could respond, he reminded her, "Every good deed deserves a reward." Rosetta sighed, thinking he was completely shameless. She cupped his chin and kissed his cheek. He froze, swallowing nervously. Rosetta smiled at his bashfulness. "Is that enough?" she asked, distracted. His magic faltered, and the bubble burst. Now sitting on the bed behind her, he used magic to dry her hair. Rosetta was pleased. "It's good to have this ability," she said. "I'll dry your hair for you every day," he promised. Rosetta laughed. "I don't need to be looked after by someone who gets flustered by a kiss from a child." He blushed. "That was an accident," he retorted. "We were underwater." She took his hand. "That's true," she said, "but I'm still glad I could spend time with you." Burying her face in the pillow, she confessed, "I'm going to tell the prince tomorrow that I'm not dead." Lifting her head, she looked at him. "I'm worried about it," she admitted, "but I think it will be all right. He's been very kind to me lately." Recalling their time together, she smiled. "Do you think he'll send me away?" she asked. Valerian's expression darkened. "Rosetta," he said. He leaned closer, bracing himself on his hands. Rosetta turned to him, startled. "What's wrong?" He stared at her. "When you're with me," he demanded, "you should only think of me." Outside, the rain poured down, drumming against the windows and stirring up painful memories. A young boy stood among a group of former servants, watching them take everything they could carry. In the same rain, this boy had lost everything. The world isn't kind to helpless, useless children. Valerian had completely given up, ready to embrace death, but then he met Rosetta. The girl greeted the boy with a smile and extended her hand to him. Perhaps it was at that moment, as he looked at the girl reaching out to him, that everything began. From then on, after her smile, even rainy days didn't seem so terrible. Rosetta saved Valerian, and when her mother died, he promised to always protect her and make her happy. The girl lying beneath him smiled slyly and asked if he was trying to tease her again. The man sat up, sighed, and then collapsed with all his might onto the pillow beside the girl. He suggested they hold hands and fall asleep, just like they used to. The girl smiled and agreed. Their hands clasped tightly. They fell asleep quietly, surrounded by silence. Armand sat at his desk, gloomy and sullen, too agitated to sleep. He placed his coffee cup on the saucer, thinking that the girl must be having a good time with her friend. The man wondered when the girl would return. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and a girl's voice asked for permission to enter. The startled man choked on his drink, coffee splashing everywhere, staining all his documents. The girl waiting for a response worried that something had happened. Then the man's voice called out, granting her permission to enter. The girl calmly walked towards the man, looking at his documents. He didn't glance at her, making her think he was in a bad mood again. Slightly annoyed, she decided to leave if he ignored her. The girl smiled and wished the prince good morning. The man finally looked up from his documents and noticed he had never seen this dress before. The girl awkwardly clutched the hem of her dress, hesitant about whether she should change. She remembered Melanie advising her not to, saying the dress was perfect for seeing the prince. Melanie had also assured her that the prince would definitely like it, persuading Rose not to change. The girl shyly admitted that the dress was a gift from a friend. The prince covered his mouth with his hand, complimenting the girl on how well she looked, clearly well rested. He then suggested Rose take the day off and not overwork herself. The girl looked up in surprise. He was already dismissing her before they had discussed anything important. Clutching her dress, she turned to the prince and said she had something to tell him, something she had been hesitant about for a long time, unsure of how he would react. Rose repeated herself, emphasizing that she felt it was important for him to know. Gathering her courage, the girl firmly stated that she wasn't going to die. The girl assured the prince that Theodore had told her she was fine and wouldn't die. Pressing her hand to her chest, she said she would always be by his side until the very end, forever his maid. The man froze, stunned, as the realization of what the girl had just said sunk in. Rose nervously awaited his reaction, confused by his silence. The girl decided it was best not to overthink things and chose to flee as originally planned. She turned to tell the prince she was leaving when his hand shot out, shouting for her to stop. Startled by his cry, the girl turned back. The man asked if she was certain she wouldn't die, gripping her wrist, asking if she was sure she would always stay with him. He almost shouted, his voice filled with emotion, asking if she would always be with him. The girl stared at the prince, overwhelmed, not expecting this reaction. Cupping her face in his hands, the man said he was glad she was all right, the news a huge relief. Blushing, he confessed that he felt the same way. Tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear, he told her his current situation was delicate because of Prince Graham and the Queen. They had to wait, or she would be put in danger. Removing his hands from her face, he added that he would be ready once he had solidified his position. He assured her he would take care of everything soon and asked if she would wait for him. The girl looked at the prince silently. She didn't understand what he was talking about, what she was supposed to wait for, or what he meant by feeling the same way. Clasping her hands together, a joyful realization dawned on her. Could it be that the prince finally understood her loyalty and was prepared to fight for the throne? Clenching her fists, she found it all so moving and promised to wait for him, no matter how long it took. Suddenly, the prince moved closer and embraced her tightly. Rosetta didn't understand what was happening. Had the prince been moved by her words to suddenly embrace her? Looking out the window, she thought it was nothing, just letting the prince cool down. She was glad everything was all right. But was everything really all right? Because from that day on, Armin's behavior completely changed. When she brought him breakfast, he asked her to sit beside him. She shyly asked if it wouldn't be better for her to eat alone, but the prince curtly told her not to be silly. He picked up a piece of food with his fork and offered it to her, telling her to try it. Obediently, she opened her mouth and tasted the food from the prince's fork. She felt quite disgruntled. The prince's actions were truly improper. Since she had said she would always stay by his side, 3 things had changed. First, His Highness had started to care about political affairs. Second, Father Theodore had become his personal priest. Lastly, his attitude towards her had become as tender as a lover's. The prince watched her with a satisfied smile. He picked up a second fork and offered it to Rosetta, saying it was her turn to feed him. She wondered, couldn't he eat by himself? Sighing, she decided to get it over with quickly and offered the food on the fork to the prince. He should eat. He remained silent, and Rosetta panicked. He then said that, as expected, food tasted better when she fed him. Relieved, she had thought she had been too forceful with the fork and commented that the chef's skills were excellent. Rosetta curtsied to the prince and said she should leave. She still didn't understand why he had changed so much. Why did he smile so tenderly every time their eyes met? She blushed, a thought bubbling up in her mind. Could His Highness be fond of her? However, she immediately dismissed the idea as absurd. They were just closer now, much like her relationship with Valerian. The smiling man gestured towards her and asked, were they really just friends? Sitting at his desk, he felt like she was avoiding him. As he wrote, he wondered if he had upset her by being too busy. The prince had appointed Theodore as his priest and resumed his duties. He was doing this to check the queen and solidify his position in the palace. Armand felt he was working hard, because only then could he and Rosetta be together. But now he couldn't even see her. What if she left? He abruptly stood up, deciding that now was the time. He decided to show her his strong side. He swung his arm in a powerful gesture. Sitting in a chair, Rosetta watched the prince practice his swordsmanship, pondering with a smile why he had invited her to the training grounds. She nibbled her thumb, wondering if the prince had guessed her nightly past. It was a shame she was so beautiful. The prince couldn't seem to form a lasting impression of her skills. Watching the men train, she thought most of them would probably be eliminated, as their skills were insufficient. However, one man caught her attention. He was quite handsome. She wondered who he was, as she hadn't seen him before. Someone called out to the man, addressing him as Alex. The man standing next to Alex panted, saying he seemed to have gotten stronger. But Alex denied it, saying he still needed more training. Rosetta memorized his name, Alex. He was talented and could protect the prince. They couldn't let him go. The prince turned and noticed Rosetta hadn't been watching him. He noticed she had been staring at the other man for a while, and Armand felt a surge of anger. He approached the man and asked if his name was Alex. The man nodded, his expression serious. The prince ordered him to spar. The man looked at Armand in alarm, unsure what he had done wrong. Their swords clashed before Rosetta, the metal ringing in the air. Rosetta was pleased everyone was so spirited, completely oblivious to the heavy atmosphere. The carriage wheels clattered against the stone pavement as she rode back with the prince. He closed his eyes, thinking it was too much. The prince shouldn't have sparred with the man at full strength. However, looking at Rosetta, he felt such a victory would surely impress her. But she suddenly spoke, telling the prince she wanted to talk about Alex. He crossed his arms, displeased by this turn of events. Rosetta told Armand that Alex was a good swordsman, and if they spent more time with him, he would surely become a valuable warrior. The man glared at Rosetta, resentful that she hadn't appreciated his efforts in the fight. Sighing and rubbing his temples, he conceded that it was good advice and he would do as she suggested. Rosetta happily thought about Alex's training tomorrow and her unwavering resolve. Suddenly, it dawned on her that Armand had agreed to her proposal so easily. It seemed His Highness now considered her a friend and respected her opinion. Perhaps this time, the future truly could be changed. As they entered the room, Armand announced he was going to bathe. Rosetta asked if he needed her to prepare anything. Armand glanced back shyly at the smiling Rosetta, who maintained her cheerful expression. He said he wouldn't force her. Rosetta immediately and happily replied that she would wait for him here. But Armand suddenly turned around, completely unbuttoning his shirt, and declared he'd changed his mind. He couldn't refuse such a kind offer. He explained, adding that he would be delighted if she could give him a massage. Rosetta thought to herself that there was no need to undress. She turned towards the door, thinking he must be mad, and said she would wait outside while he washed. However, Armand stopped her from leaving, grabbing her wrist. He asked her to wait. Rosetta blushed, but kept her eyes on Armand. He, too, gazed at her silently. They stood there, hand in hand, neither speaking. Finally, the flustered Rosetta pulled her hand away and hesitantly spoke. She darted out the door, calling back that she needed to fetch something from the bathroom. Armand reached towards the doorway, calling her name, his hand still outstretched as he watched her go. Leaning against the closed door, Rosetta pondered his unexpected words and his sudden invitation to join him in the bathroom. She acknowledged her duty to protect His Highness, even in the bath, but everything was already prepared. Now she needed an excuse for running away. Suddenly, Mr. Locke passed by, greeting Rosetta and asking why she was standing there. She noticed the basket of rubber ducks he was carrying for the bath and realized this was her salvation. Rosetta snatched the basket, declaring she needed to borrow the ducks for a moment. The startled man could only call out after her that they were for Melanie's niece. Mr. Locke knelt down, distraught that the gift he had carefully chosen for his niece was gone. Rosetta, holding the basket of ducks, announced her return and asked if His Highness was ready for his bath. Armand calmly slipped his robe off his shoulders, telling her to start the massage. The basket of ducks tumbled from Rosetta's grasp, scattering the cheerful quacking toys across the floor. Rosetta stared, open-mouthed and blushing, at Armand, then quickly lowered her head, apologizing for her clumsiness. The nearly naked man continued to watch her. Armand lay on the sofa, a blanket draped over his lower back, and instructed her to begin the massage. Rosetta, focusing on her task, found herself unexpectedly confronted with the sight of his back. Gazing at his back, Rosetta thought, those latissimus dorsi muscles are really... Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted as she abruptly punched Armand's back. Armand gasped and looked up in surprise. Rosetta immediately apologized, her cheeks burning. Rubbing the spot she had hit, Rosetta asked if he was hurt. Armand quickly reassured her, saying it just tickled. His expression, however, was grim as he cursed inwardly. He suspected Rosetta was looking for an excuse to leave. He felt uneasy, like he was forcing her. Rosetta continued to massage his back, inadvertently brushing against a sensitive area. Armand blushed and told her she could stop if she was tired. Rosetta reassured him she was fine, reminding him of her strength. Armand struggled to control the trembling of his hands, thinking that perhaps only he was uncomfortable. He thought of the icy water in the tub, how unpleasant it was, and resolved to endure it just a little longer. Rosetta wiped the oil from her hands and asked if he was ready for his bath now. Without turning around, Armand asked her to wait a little longer, explaining that there was a pleasant scent here. Rosetta was puzzled by his sudden shift from gentle affection to coldness. She excused herself to wash her hands. Armand sat on the sofa and sighed. Armand relaxed his tense muscles, feeling that everything was falling into place. He sank into the cool bath water. Rosetta watched the surprisingly relaxed Armand soaking in the bath with a flock of cheerful rubber ducks. She turned away, thinking she could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But as she took her next step, disaster struck. She slipped on the wet floor. In her haste to be of service, she hadn't been watching where she was going. Armand watched in alarm as Rosetta fell, reaching out and grabbing her elbow in an attempt to stop her. Rosetta landed in the bathtub, caught by the prince. Blushing furiously, she apologized and tried to get up, but Armand told her to wait, putting his arm around her waist and pulling her closer. He held her tightly, drawing her into an embrace. Rosetta turned to look at him, trying to understand what was happening. Before she could react, his lips were on hers, kissing her deeply. When he finally broke the kiss and looked in her face, he heard her trying to speak, her lips trembling. Rosetta scrambled to the other side of the tub, telling him to stop. Armand, agitated, asked her what was wrong. Rosetta thought he was losing his mind again. He stared at her intensely, saying she misunderstood. Sensing the situation was escalating, Rosetta grabbed one of the cheerful rubber ducks. She hurled the duck directly at his forehead, yelling at him to stop. It hit its mark, bouncing off with a cheerful squeak and landing on the floor. Rosetta jumped up, startled. Armand, struck by the duck, slumped back unconscious. Rosetta stared wearily at the prince, who had fainted yet again. Armand's eyes fluttered open as he regained consciousness. Sitting up in the bed, he wondered aloud if he had fallen asleep. Rosetta quickly confirmed, saying he'd fallen asleep as soon as he got in the bath. She thought his madness was returning. Armand pondered these symptoms, as Priest Theodore had been treating him daily, and everything seemed normal. He wondered if the kiss had been a dream. He looked at Rosetta, standing quietly before him. He suspected she might be pretending, but quickly dismissed the thought, believing his memory was faulty. He asked if his symptoms were returning, but Rosetta heard something. She held up a hand, telling him to wait, saying someone was coming. Armand was surprised, wondering how she knew. The door creaked open, revealing a sliver of the room. As the door swung fully open, the newcomer saw Armand sitting on the bed, with Rosetta standing beside him. Valerian entered the prince's room, greeting him. Armand returned the greeting, saying it had been a while, and invited him to sit, offering to have someone bring tea. Valerian declined the tea, saying he'd had enough. Rosetta wondered why he had arrived unannounced, recalling the embrace in the bathroom and wondering if he knew something. The mage explained that his sudden visit had a purpose. He produced a spoon, explaining it was a magical spoon that could detect poison. Armand, surprised, inquired about the magical spoon. Rosetta smiled, pleased. This was exactly what she wanted. She recalled giving Valerian a list of existing poisons and asking him to create an item that could detect them. He boasted that this was the best of its kind, explaining that while other similar items existed, they were far less effective. Armand found it fascinating, but didn't understand why Valerian was showing it to him. He glanced at Rosetta, feeling suspicious, but decided not to refuse the help. Valerian smiled slyly, saying, "Who knows?" He then asked Armand if he would be willing to trade Rosetta, his maid, in exchange for the spoon. Rosetta was furious. Armand's mind reeled, but he quickly composed himself, asking Valerian what he meant. Rosetta clenched her fists, wondering what this obnoxious man was implying. Valerian explained to Armand that it was Rosetta who had approached him with the request. Rosetta finally understood why he had agreed so readily to help the prince. Seething, she wondered if she should teach him a lesson. Her gaze was like a hungry tiger, ready to pounce on its prey. She fumed, thinking he was insane. Valerian, feeling her gaze, shivered, realizing the punishment she had in mind. He quickly backtracked, explaining that he was short-staffed. He coughed, adding that perhaps someone else could be arranged instead. Rosetta, arms crossed, continued to glare daggers at Valerian. Prince Armand couldn't understand if the Archmage had simply chosen Rosetta by chance, but he still ordered them not to rely on him to find someone. However, Valerian said this was impossible, as he only needed the prince's support. Armand stared at him in astonishment, not understanding what he had just said. He was surprised that Archmage Valerian was on his side. Armand decided to ask for clarification, as the first prince had likely promised him a large sum of money. Valerian didn't deny it, but he said that in this world, there was only one person he completely trusted. He looked intently at Rosetta, saying that the bond between them was beyond words. And this person was the one supporting the prince. Rosetta pressed her hands to her chest, deeply moved. Valerian concluded that this was the reason he was willing to help the prince. Valerian asked the prince if he was satisfied with this answer. Armand grasped his hand, smiling in agreement. He beamed, saying he understood because there was such a person in his life as well. Armand told Valerian that he felt they should cherish their good relationship even more now. Rosetta looked at Valerian with admiration. She thought Valerian was truly a remarkable person. He then took out a special item and showed it to Rosetta and the prince. Armand couldn't see anything special about the crystal ball. The mage explained that it was a special crystal ball capable of detecting any curse. The prince asked doubtfully how it could detect curses, as it was the first time he had heard of such a possibility. Valerian smiled smugly and said it was his crystal ball. Both Rosetta and Armand looked at the mage, Rosetta with surprise, Armand with astonishment. The mage admitted he wasn't very familiar with light magic, so using such a crystal ball was somewhat difficult. Everyone stared at the crystal ball as Valerian explained it could only be used once and had already consumed many rare materials. He added that using this kind of magic required an immensely vast amount of holy power. Armand thoughtfully repeated the mage's words about holy power. Then he said he knew the right person for the job. Theodore looked excitedly at the two men, saying it was a great honor for him that the prince and the archmage had sought him out. Valerian looked at Theodore in confusion, wondering why the man was glowing so happily. The mage pointed at the crystal ball and suggested the priest place his hand on it. Valerian explained that the crystal ball would detect any curses within the room. When Theodore infused it with holy power, the location of the curse would appear in red within the crystal ball. The prince immediately cautioned Theodore not to overexert himself, emphasizing that his safety was paramount. Valerian reassured the prince not to worry, and Theodore began to slowly infuse his power. As he did, red dots gradually appeared beneath the surface of the crystal ball. The three of them stared at the crystal ball in surprise. For a moment, no one spoke. Valerian asked everyone to wait, as he himself was shocked. The prince silently watched the crystal ball, his face grim. Rosetta opened her mouth and uttered just two words. "It's over." Everyone stared at the crystal ball, the crimson glow devoid of any blue. The prince looked at the mage and asked what the probability of the crystal ball being wrong was. Valerian said it was impossible, as the crystal ball was only used once, but it was extremely effective. The prince fell silent again. He was lost in thought. Rosetta, watching the prince, realized the entire room was cursed. She clenched her fists, angry with herself. This was her mistake. 4 time travels, and she hadn't detected anything unusual. When she was still a knight, she had checked the room, but it was too late. There were only a few possibilities. First, the curse would disappear automatically in a few years. Second, someone had removed the curses before the inspection. The only conclusion was that there was a traitor among them. Rosetta continued to watch the prince, thinking that although there was no evidence, the entire room being cursed would lead anyone to believe there was a traitor among them. Judging by the prince's grim expression, he understood this as well. Armand thought to himself that he should be happy that fate had brought Rosetta to his side, but why was he once again caught in endless trouble? Did he not deserve happiness? Armand felt as if he were in a vacuum and heard his deceased mother's voice again. "You see it yourself clearly." She continued to whisper in his ear, saying that losing something precious was always incredibly frightening and painful. He felt as if he were standing in a crowd again, understanding that chasing unattainable things was meaningless. She continued to hold his shoulder, saying he should understand this more than anyone. He should let go of those empty dreams. The man stood with his eyes closed, tears slipping down his cheeks. Rosetta tried to call out to Armand, and the man opened his eyes, looking at her. Rosetta stood before the prince, holding out her hand, promising that nothing terrible would happen and that they would face everything together. The man crossed his arms, watching the girl who still held out her hand to him. The girl reiterated her promise to protect him, assuring him that everything would be all right. The man looked at her, feeling the warmth in her words. Suddenly, Theodore also called out to the prince, echoing the girl's words. Placing his hand on his chest, he declared their willingness to give their lives for him. A soft chuckle sounded from his side. Valerian thoughtfully touched his cheek with a finger, stating that as he had said, he would stand by the prince. Armand lowered his head, closing his eyes, and expressed his gratitude to everyone present. He turned to the group and announced they had something very important to do. First, they had to destroy the cursed room. The next day, the palace was bustling with activity. A woman pressed her hands to her chest, sobbing. Armand asked her what was wrong. The woman didn't hide her emotions, screaming and demanding to know who was responsible, insisting the culprit be found and punished. The man urged her to calm down, assuring her he was completely fine. However, the woman continued to cry, saying she had heard he was going to destroy the room. She asked if he had really thought it through, reminding him his safety was everyone's priority. The girl watched as the woman placed her hand on the prince's shoulder, and the prince thanked her for her concern. Rosetta thought to herself that she now knew there was a traitor among them. Despite the woman's reaction, Lady Robin couldn't be ruled out as a suspect, considering she was the one who had sent the poisonous flowers. The girl wondered if the woman was genuinely worried about the prince or just trying to deflect suspicion. The woman placed her hand on the man, saying she trusted his decision. The woman suggested that while clearing the room might be the right course of action, it would be best to look for evidence first or postpone the destruction. The prince thanked Betty for her concern, while Rosetta questioned whether she had misjudged the situation. The chiming of a clock reminded everyone present that a considerable amount of time had passed. Armand announced he had to attend a meeting, and the woman apologized for delaying him. The girl bowed to the prince, urging him to take care. The prince smiled at her. He made a promise to her. The girl, slightly flustered, watched the man with her mouth slightly agape. The man walked along the white corridor towards the meeting that would decide the fate of the room. After hearing about the curse, the man had moved to a sanctuary, but officially changing his residence wasn't easy. The room used by generations of Armans was the residence of the Ragnar Empire's heir. This was a crucial part of the story. The prince's desire to abandon these rooms had sparked opposition from the nobles, hence the meeting. A man confidently declared the curse to be nonsense, questioning whether the priest hadn't found anything unusual. Another man pointed out that the crystal ball used to detect the curse was also suspicious, dismissing it as utter rubbish. Someone began to suggest that the rumors about the prince going mad might be true, unaware of Armand's arrival. Those seated at the table were somewhat embarrassed. Armand cleared his throat, stating that since everyone wanted to speak, they should begin the meeting. A man raised his hand, requesting to speak first. The prince looked closely at the speaker and recognized him. The speaker was Count Mottman, the Empress's brother. The prince settled more comfortably and gestured for him to begin. The man stated that the priest had searched his room for hours and found nothing. The prince casually remarked that the priest didn't possess the necessary abilities. The man cleared his throat, considering his response, then declared that insulting the Temple of Finlia was an insult to the national religion. He turned to the archbishop, asking if they had inspected the room and found any trace of a curse. He looked at the prince, stating this meant his curse detector was useless and that he didn't even know where it came from. The crown prince seized the opportunity to speak. He sarcastically remarked that some strange person had tricked his brother and now brought the matter to the meeting. The man, feeling triumphant, pointed at the prince and suggested that perhaps his brother really did have a problem. The two princes stared at each other, neither breaking eye contact. A tense silence filled the air. Prince Armand angrily cursed Grayhan as a true scoundrel. Just then, a woman's voice rang out, reminding the prince that she had warned him to watch his language. The empress entered the council chamber. A beautiful woman with blonde hair and blue eyes. She wore a black dress and carried herself with an air of authority. All the men rose and bowed their heads in greeting. The woman smiled and asked the prince if she was permitted to be there. Armand responded with a smile of his own, asking if there was anywhere the eldest member of the imperial family couldn't go. After the woman sat down, she said that she had heard the prince was ill and had rushed over, so worried she hadn't even had time to choose her attire properly. The prince laughed inwardly, thinking she could easily wear such a dress to a banquet. He wasn't afraid of her words. However, only fools like Greyhin feared her. Feeling his mother's support, the prince began to speak of his highness's discomfort and the worry it had caused his mother, leading to these strange rumors. Looking at the speaker, Armand requested that they refrain from making further baseless accusations. The man retorted, asking if he was interested in these rumors. The prince chuckled, pleased with himself for bringing up the subject of madness at the meeting. Now he wanted to see how things would unfold. He then asked what the rumors actually were. Greyhin confidently declared that everyone was saying His Highness, the Crown Prince, was mad. Armand was satisfied with this statement. He laughed pleasantly and asked if it was true. Propping himself up on his elbow, he said everyone knew the local priest examined him daily and had never said anything of the sort. As Count Mottman had said earlier, such talk was an insult and an attack on the state religion. The man nervously wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief, saying he generally agreed with that sentiment. His hand slammed down on the table. Greyhin abruptly jumped up from his seat, loudly ranting that the priest couldn't possibly know everything, and that Armand following those charlatans only confirmed the rumors. A woman wearing elegant lace gloves raised her hand, interrupting the prince. The woman lowered her head, saying that at least out of respect for his brother, he shouldn't raise his voice. Looking at the prince, she said he couldn't just suggest destroying a room so important to the empire on a whim. If it would ease his mind, she would agree, and it would ease her heart as well. But, she continued, there were other matters to discuss. The empress looked at the prince, saying she had heard he was quite close with a certain maid. Feigning concern, the woman said that as his mother, she worried about him taking a lover before marriage. He blindly believed in this so-called curse, yet he couldn't prove it. Had this woman deceived him? The man clenched his fists. He knew the empress would find out about Rosetta one day, but he couldn't understand how she dared insult the girl. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to remain calm. When the time was right, he would strike back. Someone knocked on the meeting room door. Everyone turned to look, wondering who it could be. The person who entered, with a smile on their face, remarked how could such a rash conclusion be drawn with such shallow insight. Everyone was surprised by this person's appearance. Everyone present wondered if they were truly seeing him. The man who entered bowed and introduced himself as William Winterfried, offering greetings to the two princes and the empress. The empress said with displeasure that no matter how great he was, he had no right to barge into the meeting. She was interrupted by Armand. The prince, looking at the mage, said that he had invited him. The man then told the empress not to worry so much, lest her fragile heart give out. The woman was displeased. Nothing was going according to her plan. Someone asked the prince why he had invited the mage. The prince replied that the item under discussion at the meeting was made by him. Someone immediately and angrily asked if the prince's room was truly cursed. Armand calmly confirmed this to Duke Runner. The Duke then asked why the high priest hadn't discovered anything. Realizing he was in a difficult position, the high priest began to stammer, excusing himself by saying that curses were difficult to detect in a short time and required long-term observation. Count Mottman immediately questioned loudly how the high priest, as his majesty's servant, could draw such a hasty conclusion. The high priest fell silent, looking towards Greyhin with a pleading gaze. The prince feigned indifference, as if the topic had nothing to do with him. The high priest lowered his head, understanding he had no other choice. After the meeting, several decisions were made. First, the empress and Greyhin, disagreeing with the high priest, decided to send him to the Vatican to discuss his situation. They didn't destroy the room, as lifting the curse would take a long time, so they simply sealed it off. As for the crystal ball, the meeting concluded after Valerian explained how to make it. Prince Armand walked down the hallway, wondering where the girl was. He had a lot to tell her. Suddenly, he heard the girl call his name. Turning around, he saw her smiling and asking how the meeting went. Before she could even mention that he might be tired, he embraced her, kissing the back of her head. He told her to just stay like that. The girl leaned against him excitedly, her cheeks flushing. She felt incredibly comfortable and peaceful in his arms. Suddenly, she noticed Valerian standing there with his arms crossed, scowling at the embracing couple. The three of them continued to stand in the hallway. Valerian's expression darkened as he watched their tender embrace. He looked at the girl, inwardly questioning what her relationship with this fallen person truly was. Looking at the mage, the girl responded internally that they had no relationship. They were just master and knight, Lena. She tried to push Armand away, saying there were others present. He released her, admitting it was his fault. With a gentle expression, he lowered his head and apologized, saying he had caused her trouble and asked for her forgiveness. Looking at the prince, who resembled a kitten that had done something wrong, the girl thought he finally realized his mistake. Watching him, she thought he was truly adorable, like a kitten caught misbehaving. Valerian continued to stare at the girl, silently commanding her to come to her senses. Slightly embarrassed, the girl asked Armand if he was tired and if he wanted her to take him back to his room, offering to make him some calming tea. He agreed. The man watched as the girl turned, saying His Highness needed a rest, so he should leave. Valerian was taken aback by this turn of events, not expecting her to say that. The girl was surprised that the prince already had a new room so soon after the meeting. Armand told her the matter was serious, so they had to act quickly. He raised a cup of coffee to his lips, mentioning that the banquet and hunting festival were to be held in 3 days. The girl remembered the festival, but her memories of it weren't pleasant. It was there that she first lost His Highness. If she wanted to protect him, she had to attend, but only partners could be present. The girl thought that perhaps she should continue pretending to be dying so she could request to accompany the prince. Then she remembered the dress she had ordered from the shop and asked if it had been delivered to Lady Runner. Armand was surprised by her question. The dress hadn't been sent anywhere. He said the dress suited her perfectly. Rosetta was surprised. That was true, but from the girl's perspective, the dress wasn't meant for her. The man looked at the girl, clarifying that the dress was bought specifically for her. He extended his hand towards her, sincerely asking if she would accompany him to the festival. Rosetta opened her mouth, hesitantly trying to speak. The girl covered her mouth with her hand, realizing she almost asked, "Why me?" Then, covering her entire face with both hands, she wondered what would happen if she refused. Armand didn't understand her reaction. Was she truly so moved that she couldn't speak? The girl thought that there were only 3 days left, and he couldn't appear alone at the end, or Greyhen would tease him about it forever. She also thought about what would happen to the innocent Lady Runner, feeling sorry for her. The girl told Armand that she was just a maid, without the appropriate status, and he couldn't bring her. If their positions were different, she would gladly accept his invitation. But the prince said everything had already been decided. The girl froze in shock, not understanding how he couldn't grasp what she was saying. Armand said her origins wouldn't be a problem. She was the only person he was willing to entrust his heart, and body too. The girl asked about Lady Runner, as she was his fiancée. The prince replied that he didn't know where she'd heard that from. He wasn't his father and would never do anything so immoral, nor would he marry multiple women. Then, looking at her tenderly, he called her Rosie, saying he would formally tell her something on the day of the banquet. Hearing him say that, the girl was completely stunned. That's why she had to stay by his side the next day. As she cleaned the hallway, the girl was distracted, her mind preoccupied with the same thought. While washing dishes, she recalled all the unusual actions and strange words, piecing the events together. The girl began to suspect the reason behind this behavior. A plate slipped from her grasp. The plate shattered into tiny fragments. As the realization dawned on her that the prince liked her, she thought it would be joyous and exciting news if he truly loved her. But first and foremost, she was still a knight who had witnessed the prince's death many times. A deep bond existed between them, but could she bear it? Lying in bed, the girl thought these were needless worries. If the prince confessed, she should be able to reject him. Just then, soft footsteps approached. Without opening her eyes, the girl pondered the meaning of these footsteps, wondering what more he wanted to say to her. The man approached her bedside. Then, he gently called her name. The girl drowsily opened her eyes and looked at the man who had entered. The next moment, the prince was on top of her, trying to kiss her. The girl clutched her pillow tightly as the clock chimed, marking the passage of time. Their lips parted, releasing hot breaths. The anxious girl tried to bring the prince to his senses, but he continued speaking. He gazed at her with mesmerizing eyes, saying that she, too, yearned for him. Flustered and shy, her cheeks flushed, she looked at the prince. He grasped her wrist, In that moment, she thought about how the high priest treated the prince every day, yet the symptoms couldn't be completely eradicated. She pondered this beneath him. He must have been too stressed at the meeting, she thought, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to call out to the prince. But the girl fell silent, her thoughts fading away. The man moved off her, raising his body. Rosetta, no longer feeling his touch, opened her eyes, confused as to why he had suddenly frozen. Armand clutched his head, asking her why he was there. They sat side by side on the edge of the bed. In the silence, the man mustered his courage and told her he wanted to hear her say something, then hesitantly asked if he had assaulted her. The girl lowered her head, softly confirming his suspicion. After receiving her answer, he pressed further, asking if he had attacked her with the intention of hitting her. The girl confirmed this as well. Trying to lighten the mood, she said it was all right. She had everything under control. The prince clasped his hands on his knees, saying he had let it happen again. He knelt before her, begging for forgiveness. He bowed his head, saying he had no excuse. Even if he had 10 mouths, he couldn't explain himself. Rosetta frantically waved her hands, asking what His Highness was doing, urging him to get up. Despite her words, the prince continued, saying he had acted terribly. His condition wasn't an excuse to humiliate her, and pleaded for her forgiveness. The girl looked at him, saying there was no need to apologize. She understood his struggles, and urged him to rise. Armand said this had never happened before. Rosetta watched the prince, waiting for him to continue. He explained that when he transformed into the beast, he was always irritable and took his anger out on others, but he had never done anything like this to anyone. The girl was surprised by his words, wondering why he treated her so differently. The prince had only one guess as to why, and then he gently took her hand. He said his actions were a reflection of unconscious desires. Rosetta froze in astonishment, realizing it wasn't something he truly wanted to happen. She looked at the prince, wondering if he truly liked her. He said no words could make up for his transgression. He was truly sorry and promised it wouldn't happen again. Looking at her, he placed his hand on his chest and said that if he ever did anything crazy again, she should throw him out, even hit him. The girl asked, bewildered, why she should do that, thinking he might die, but he wouldn't relent, pressing her to agree to his request. He confessed that he didn't want to kiss her while he wasn't in his right mind. The girl softly asked what he meant. She leaned closer, asking if he felt the same way when he was conscious. Their fingers intertwined, his gaze fixed on her. He countered by asking why she would ask such a question, then moved closer. Their lips parted, both yearning for a kiss. However, the man suddenly pulled back slightly, silently looking at her. Then, he also stood up silently, his back to her, and said it wasn't the right time for a kiss. He left the bewildered girl on the floor, apologizing for waking her and saying she could relax now. The girl slowly came to her senses, sighing deeply, and then she collapsed back onto the bed with all her might, resting her hand on her forehead and closing her eyes, thinking that he definitely wasn't indifferent to her. The girl was surprised it had taken her so long to realize this. Morning arrived, and life in the castle stirred once more. A gloomy Valerian stood there, demanding an explanation from the girl. He asked the confused girl why that jerk had hugged her yesterday. The girl stood there, her fingers intertwined, unsure how to begin, stammering. Her face flushed. She said he wouldn't believe her, because it seemed Prince Armand liked her. Valerian was surprised that the prince had confessed to her. The girl looked away, saying that the prince hadn't actually confessed, but then she looked at Valerian, who asked, "What about her?" Valerian wanted to know her feelings for Prince Armand, so he asked her directly if she liked the prince. The girl's cheeks flushed, and she stammered, averting her gaze. She said of course not. How could she allow herself to do such a thing? Then she told him to stop talking nonsense. How could she dare to fall in love with him? Valerian clenched his fists, unhappy with the girl's words. He believed Prince Armand wasn't worthy of Rosetta's love. However, he was worried about the girl's adamant denial. So he decided to ask what she would do if the prince suddenly confessed to her. The girl fell silent, looking down at the ground. She said if she rejected him, they would be separated, and then she wouldn't be able to protect him, which worried her even more. Valerian listened silently to the girl's conclusion. Then the girl added that, besides all that, Prince Armand also had Lady Runner. She looked at Valerian and said that because of this, She couldn't accept the prince's feelings, which was only natural. Valerian was very pleased with the girl's words. He hugged her, saying she was right, and that getting entangled with that degenerate was a waste of time. Valerian leaned closer to the girl, saying he was skeptical when she first told him about the prince's engagement, but after hearing the duke's words, he thought it was possible. The girl laughed happily, saying they would find out at the banquet. Valerian asked if the girl would be at the banquet, and she replied that she would be there, but not as a maid. The girl admitted somewhat shyly that she would be attending as the prince's partner. Valerian smiled grimly, thinking that Rosetta hadn't let her guard down for a moment, and then said he would be going too. The girl was surprised, as Valerian didn't usually attend such events. He took her hand, saying he had to protect her. Then, Valerian raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. The girl froze at a loss for words. She looked at Valerian as the carriage continued on its way, its wheels rattling loudly on the stone pavement. Sitting in the carriage, the girl found Valerian's behavior very strange. Valerian said he would be with her and asked why she was reluctant to make their relationship public, wondering if she was ashamed of him. The girl said if they went public, pretending to be strangers in front of the prince would be awkward and might cause some unpleasant misunderstandings. Valerian looked at the girl grimly. He didn't mind those misunderstandings. Rosetta sat in the carriage, wondering what Valerian had been thinking lately and why he had become so forward. Melanie saw the girl walking down the hallway, and Maloney said they were just talking about her. Rosetta asked what they were gossiping about. The girls excitedly said something amazing had happened. Rosetta didn't understand what had happened for a moment, and excitedly asked if it had anything to do with the prince. However, the girls reassured her, saying it had nothing to do with the prince, but with her. Rosetta didn't understand how it could have anything to do with her. As fireworks went off, the girls said they heard Rosetta would be the prince's partner at the ball, and the news had spread throughout the palace. Rosetta was a little embarrassed, saying she didn't know how it had happened, wondering how they had found out. Suddenly, Melanie took Rosetta's hand and said they would help her from now on. Rosetta didn't understand what kind of help she needed, as the banquet was still 2 days away. Melanie said they would help her prepare for the banquet, although these few days wouldn't be enough. Looking at the girl's reaction, someone asked if she also appreciated their sincerity. Melanie said they had even dedicated their rare weekend to this, and Rosetta was surprised they were working even then. Rosetta didn't understand why the girls were working so hard, but Melanie took her hand and said she hoped Rosetta understood. They had selected a vast array of cosmetics to prepare her for the banquet. The girl rubbed hand cream onto her hands and then lay down on the sofa while the other girls bustled around, attending to her. Rosetta felt lucky to be able to lie there peacefully while others prepared her for the banquet. Her thoughts were interrupted by Melanie, who asked if she had eaten dinner yet. The girl was about to answer when some of the face cream Melanie was applying got in her mouth. Annoyed, she told Melanie to be quiet and concentrate on the application. Rosetta didn't understand why Melanie had to ask her questions at that moment. Then Melanie added that since she probably hadn't eaten, she could only have one piece of bread during the pre-banquet refreshments and nothing else. Rosetta tried to protest, but more cream ended up in her mouth. Melanie reminded her again not to speak. The girl's favorite time of day finally arrived. Nightfall, the time for sneaking around. Barefoot on the cold floor, she headed towards her destination. She padded into the kitchen in her night clothes and stared blankly at the vegetables. She was simply too hungry to sleep. Looking at the ingredients, she wondered, was it really this hard to be beautiful? Perhaps even harder than learning swordsmanship. As she reached for a loaf of bread, she told herself she would only have one slice. Suddenly, she heard someone call her name and jumped. Melanie was standing in the doorway, asking if she was planning on eating more. She quickly turned around, forcing a smile and denying it, while wondering how she, a trained swordswoman, hadn't noticed Melanie's approach. Melanie reminded her that Prince Armand would be escorting her personally to the celebration, so she needed to be more disciplined until then. Rosetta couldn't refuse the girl who was being so kind to her. She endured her hunger, trying to soothe her rumbling stomach. Finally, the day of the banquet arrived. The girls started preparing for the banquet early in the morning. The tailor was making the final adjustments to her dress, Melanie was styling her hair, and everyone was working hard to make her look flawless. However, the girl was oblivious to all of this. She anxiously watched the door, waiting for the prince to appear. She hadn't seen him since that night and was filled with anticipation. The thought of seeing him made her incredibly nervous. The girl sighed, trying to calm herself. She resolved that if the prince confessed his feelings, she would calmly reject him, and then she wouldn't have to worry anymore. Suddenly, a male voice asked if she was there, and the girl's eyes snapped open. The door began to open, but she couldn't yet see who was entering. The girl stared at the doorway, her heart pounding with expectation. Her wish had come true. Prince Armand was walking into the room. He looked at her intently, saying nothing. The girl, nervous, wondered why he was silent. Under his gaze, the nervous girl even felt that this attire didn't suit her at all. She was more comfortable in her knight's uniform. Suddenly, the prince spoke, saying it was too much. Everyone in the room looked at him in surprise, but he continued, smiling, and said she was too beautiful. The girl finally relaxed and greeted the prince with a smile. The others were so moved by the scene that they were momentarily speechless. The carriage wheels rolled quickly over the cobblestones as they hurried towards the banquet. He looked at the girl sitting opposite him and asked if she was feeling unwell. The girl said she was fine, but in truth, she was trying to hide her embarrassment. Attempting to change the subject, she asked if he was hot, as his clothes seemed too thick for the summer weather. He asked her if there was anything else she wanted to say. The girl asked, puzzled, what he meant. He smiled and said he had chosen his finest attire for a special someone. He leaned forward, resting on his elbows, and asked her to admire his outfit. The girl stared at him in surprise. The girl silently called upon the saints, completely baffled by his behavior. Hesitantly, she said he looked noble, to which he replied that it was an honor to receive her compliment. He said that by the time they arrived, many nobles would already be at the palace, so all eyes would be on her. He also told her to let him know if anyone bothered her. The girl decided to ask what would happen if that did occur. Placing his hand on his neck, the man slyly asked Rosetta what she thought he could do. Rosetta's eyes widened as she stared at the prince, unable to utter a single word. Realizing she wouldn't answer, he simply asked her to come closer. Rosetta complied, thinking it would be increasingly difficult to refuse him. Darkness fell quickly, and the carriage finally reached its destination. The prince extended his hand to help Rosetta out of the carriage, telling her to follow him. He waited patiently for her to offer her hand, which she eventually did, her fingertips barely brushing his palm. Hand in hand, they entered the hall. Someone greeted His Highness, and all heads turned towards the entrance. The herald announced the arrival of His Royal Highness, Armand Baldwin von Ragnar, Crown Prince of the Great Ragnar Empire. He also announced the prince's companion as Rosetta Mayfield. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, commenting on the lady the prince had brought. By mentioning her last name, they tried to discern her family background. Someone mentioned hearing that she had been a maid. Rosetta had anticipated this reaction. In her past life, people had said she became the prince's knight only by seducing him. Suddenly, someone blocked their path. Valerian bowed to the prince. He casually inquired about the prince's well-being. Whispers immediately erupted from the crowd, confirming the rumors that the great mage was indeed on the prince's side and seemed quite pleased about it. They speculated on what the prince could have possibly done to earn such respect from the great mage. Valerian gazed intently at Rosetta, finding her radiant tonight. She looked away, feeling his burning gaze linger. Armand admitted his surprise at the mage's presence. Valerian replied that he had to appear since the prince was there. Rosetta thought to herself that it was fortunate this gentleman knew how to separate public and private matters. The prince then said he appreciated the sentiment, but there was no need to force himself. Noticing the mage's attention on Rosetta, the prince asked if he had any business with his companion. Valerian smiled, saying he was simply captivated by her beauty. Hearing this, Rosetta mentally retracted her previous thought. The prince's expression darkened, but he still thanked him for the compliment. Rosetta could feel the awkward tension thickening. They continued on. They still needed to greet the emperor and empress. Bowing before the throne, the prince mentioned it had been a while since he had seen his father, which the emperor confirmed. The empress interjected with a smile, saying that this was the first time their son had brought a lady to such an event, and that the emperor was also curious to learn more about her. Rosetta smiled sweetly, understanding the empress's intentions. Then, lifting her skirt, she curtsied and greeted the emperor and empress of the Ragnar Empire, introducing herself as Rosetta Mayfield of Baron Mayfield's house. The empress looked displeased at the girl who had clearly prepared and learned the proper etiquette beforehand. The empress narrowed her eyes, considering her next move. Then she asked Rosetta what she did at Armand's palace. Valerian, who had been closely observing the situation, sensed the rising tension and stepped forward, interrupting the empress and bowing to both the emperor and empress. He immediately apologized for interrupting, and the empress magnanimously pretended nothing was amiss. Rosetta thought Valerian always seemed to appear at the most opportune moments. The emperor greeted the mage, asking him why he had come. Valerian explained that he had formed a special relationship with the prince and couldn't refuse his invitation. Rosetta watched the scene unfold, thinking that now both the nobles and the royal family had witnessed the amicable relationship between the prince and Valerian, and this would help solidify Armin's claim to the throne. Smiling, she thought that people would surely want to see such a ruler ascend to the throne. However, being the prince's companion was proving more difficult than being his exclusive knight. Rosetta felt her smile beginning to ache. Suddenly, a man approached, asking the prince about his recent health. It was Duke Runner, Lady Runner's father. The prince replied that thanks to him, he was doing well. The duke expressed his relief and suggested they speak privately. Rosetta, realizing they were likely going to discuss a marriage alliance, felt she needed to excuse herself. She told the prince she was going to try some refreshments and rest for a bit, as she was feeling a little hungry. The duke immediately asked if she was truly all right, and Rosetta nodded in agreement. The man told her not to go anywhere and to wait for him, reminding her he had something to tell her. Rosetta savored the cake, wondering if the prince was about to confess his feelings. She also wondered if Lady Runner would be angry if he rejected the duke's proposal. The thought filled her with guilt. Suddenly, someone approached. A voice called out. It was the girl from the dress shop, Ashley Babbles, sarcastically asking if this was Rosetta's first time trying such a delicacy. It was the same girl who had embarrassed her the last time they met. Rosetta smiled sweetly and asked who it was, then replied, "Why, it's Miss Babbles from that poor, insignificant family." Ashley threw her arms out, exclaiming that Rosetta was being rude. Rosetta retorted, "Did you really think I'd say something so dreadful to you?" Rosetta stepped closer, saying she was merely repeating what Ashley had said at the dress shop. "Your face reminds me of it, so I couldn't help myself." Ashley's face flushed red. Rosetta added mockingly, "You need to relearn your etiquette. The Viscount will be disappointed if he hears you speak like that." Rosetta clearly had the upper hand in this verbal sparring match, leaving Ashley reeling from the blows. Furious, Ashley thought, how dare this impertinent woman think she's better than me, just because of an expensive dress. Trying to compose herself, Ashley acknowledged their previous encounter and decided to introduce herself, asking for Rosetta's name. Rosetta calmly stated her name, thinking this might finally steer the conversation elsewhere. Ashley sneered, "That's the first time I've ever heard of that family." Rosetta thought, "I'm so tired of hearing that." Ashley continued her taunts, "It seems you don't understand high society at all. I could take you to a proper atelier." Rosetta feigned surprise. "Is this dress not good enough?" Ashley scrutinized Rosetta's dress, a flicker of awkwardness crossing her face. Rosetta said, "Ever since I arrived, everyone's been staring. It's quite embarrassing." Then, with a smile, she added, "If you think this dress is so inadequate, perhaps you could tell me which atelier could create a better one." Ashley fumed, her mind racing for a comeback. She couldn't deny it. The dress was stunning. Looking at Rosetta, she thought, "I'm so sick of those dress shop clothes, but what else can I wear?" Ashley thought, everyone must be wondering where to get a dress like that. She clutched her own skirt, barely containing her frustration. This maid's arrogance is infuriating. Does she really think the prince favors her above everyone else? She feigned nonchalance, asking, "Who cares about Rosetta's cheap little shop?" However, her words were immediately met with a chorus of curious voices. The surrounding people murmured, "That girl is so arrogant, utterly unreasonable. I will be mortified. Why would she refuse such an opportunity?" Ashley noticed the shift in the crowd's attitude. She didn't understand what was happening. She had never encountered this before. Wanting to vent her anger, she snapped, "Maid, bring me some wine." She snatched a glass from a passing maid and gulped it down, thinking, "I'll get this maid drunk and teach her a lesson." But then, Ashley's eyes widened. She sputtered, spraying the mouthful of wine everywhere. Outraged cries erupted around her. She stained her dresses. "This girl is a menace." Ashley held up the glass, demanding to know what was in it, why it was so sour. The maid standing beside, Ashley rushed forward, offering to clean it up. Rosetta looked closely and realized it was Melanie. Rosetta was stunned. Melanie had likely added vinegar to the wine to protect her. Melanie looked smug. She wouldn't let anyone hurt Rosetta. Ashley rounded on Melanie, accusing her of tampering with the wine. Melanie apologized and asked why Ashley was blaming her. Finally, Ashley exploded. "How dare you? Do you know who you're talking to?" The wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. Melanie closed her eyes, bracing for a blow, but it never came. Rosetta had caught Ashley's hand just as she tried to strike Melanie. Ashley stared at Rosetta in disbelief as she listened to her own cool voice continue. She said the girl was simply unaccustomed to the taste of expensive wine and shouldn't shift the blame. Ashley trembled slightly with suppressed fury, trying to speak, but choked on her words from the sheer force of her emotions. The startled girl couldn't understand how Rosetta possessed such strength. With a gentle smile, Rosetta told Ashley to be careful. If she continued like this, she would eventually get into trouble. Suddenly, another woman's voice brought their quarrel to a halt. The women turned in surprise towards the sound. It was Lady Runner. She demanded to know how they could cause such a scene in the ballroom. Had they gone mad? Approaching Ashley, she said insulting the prince's partner was the worst possible decision. Hadn't she considered the consequences? In front of everyone, Ashley tried to defend herself, but Lady Runner said she didn't want to hear any excuses. She approached Rosetta and, with a slight bow, introduced herself as Paisley, daughter of Duke Runner. Rosetta couldn't understand why this girl was helping her, as in her view, she must appear to be the prince's mistress. Paisley asked if she would mind joining her on the balcony for a chat. Rosetta agreed. As they stood on the balcony admiring the beautiful scenery, Rosetta wondered if this girl intended to humiliate her privately. Pressing her hand to her forehead, she realized she still didn't know what to say. She was certain anyone would feel awkward facing their fiancé's mistress. Paisley offered Rosetta a glass of wine and asked if she liked sweet wine. Rosetta reached out and took the glass, saying she did. Having anticipated such a gesture, she held the glass in her hand. The girl took a sip and found the wine delicious. Then she asked Rosetta not to be so formal with her, as she wished to address her by her first name, to which Rosetta didn't object. Rosetta was about to take another sip when she heard Paisley call her name. She said she knew Rosetta and the prince weren't involved. Hearing this, Rosetta froze, wine glass in hand. Seeing Rosetta's surprise, Paisley said the prince wouldn't have a mistress. Rosetta replied, of course, she wasn't the prince's mistress. She waved her hand dismissively, saying she wasn't the prince's partner, only here because he had no other choice. But Paisley didn't believe her, saying the prince would rather come alone than with a strange man. Rosetta looked at the girl, unsure what she was thinking. There was clearly a misunderstanding between them. Nervous with this thought, the girl tried to relax. Paisley looked at Rosetta and confessed she had no feelings for the crown prince. Rosetta was surprised. She knew nothing about this. Paisley continued, saying she had no interest in the prince at all. Rosetta was stunned when the girl said she was interested in her. Paisley said that when she saw how easily Rosetta had silenced Ashley, she knew there was something special about her. Rosetta began to worry, wondering if Paisley had detected the magical fluctuations within her or something. Paisley then said they would have much to discuss later, but there was no rush. She turned towards the balcony entrance, saying another guest wished to see Rosetta, and excused herself. Looking at the figure of a man, Rosetta wondered when His Highness had arrived. After bidding farewell to the girl, Lady Runner left the balcony. Rosetta was surprised. Had Paisley actually arranged a private conversation with the prince for her? A man stepped onto the balcony and, addressing Rosetta, said he had something to tell her. He asked if she had been drinking a lot, as he could smell alcohol on her, but as far as he could tell, she wasn't drunk. Rosetta reassured the prince, saying she'd only had one glass and wouldn't get drunk. The prince said he was glad to hear it, as such a conversation couldn't be had with someone intoxicated. The girl nervously fidgeted with her fingers, anticipating what he would say next. The man approached her, saying his situation remained precarious. With that, he raised his hand and gently touched her neck. He twirled a strand of her hair between his fingers, saying he loved her so much he couldn't control his feelings. Rosetta looked at the man, placing a hand on her chest. She had foreseen this moment, yet she still couldn't quite believe it was happening. Whenever His Highness was near, her heart would race. She didn't understand why she could never push away those approaching lips, nor why she searched within herself time and again for the courage to reject him. Perhaps the root of this wisdom was her love for him. The girl's eyes reflected only the figure of the man she loved deeply. She truly loved him. Suddenly, the girl asked the prince why he liked her. The man said there were too many reasons to count and looked away, but the girl still asked him to list them all. The man said he liked her blue eyes that looked directly at him, her cheeks that flushed with shyness, and the corners of her mouth that curved slightly upwards in a beautiful smile. He said she was a little shy, but strong inside, despite appearing fragile. The girl's voice conveyed all her thoughts without reservation. The man caressed her cheek, saying that everything about her was lovely and remarkable, smiling. The man asked how could he not love her if she had given him life. Faced with such a confession, the girl said it was an exaggeration. The girl asked how she could push him away after hearing those words. She placed her hand on his chest. She said she loved him too. The man gazed at the girl, unblinking, as if holding his breath. Prince Armand embraced the girl and asked if she would be with him. Tears welled up in the girl's eyes as she agreed. The man reached into the inner pocket of his tailcoat and opened a box. He said he wanted to give her a necklace similar to his own because he was worried her jewelry wasn't dazzling enough. The girl found the matching jewelry lovely and thanked the prince. He leaned closer and asked if he could kiss her. The girl smiled and softly agreed. The man held her and kissed her. It was the kiss he had longed for his entire life. The man couldn't help but draw closer and closer to the girl. The girl looked at the man with excitement. Their eyes met, and only one thought occupied both their minds. The man really wanted to embrace her, but they couldn't do that here. He thought about how he couldn't let Rosetta hate him. The girl saw right through him and asked if they should go home. The man looked at the girl excitedly, pondering her words. Realizing what she had said, the girl waved her hands in a panic, saying she just thought it was time to go home and nothing else. She was embarrassed by her poor phrasing. The man agreed, saying they had been there a long time and could leave. The carriage sped towards the prince's palace, carrying the two whose lives had been completely changed. Having confessed their feelings, the two sat opposite each other in the carriage, afraid to even touch. The girl looked at the man, thinking that she used to find the love stories Melanie enjoyed complicated, but now she suddenly understood them all. Back home, the girl thought they would each retire to their rooms. Suddenly, it all felt like a dream, so she called out to the prince. The girl looked at the prince and suggested they have a drink. Prince Armand looked at the girl, not understanding what she meant. A bottle of wine and 2 glasses were placed on the table. The girl thought to herself that she didn't want to act as if nothing had happened. They didn't clink glasses, but simply sat on the sofa, embracing and kissing. They kissed passionately, pausing occasionally to catch their breath. The girl felt herself going mad as she kissed the prince. When a man kissed her and pushed her down on the sofa, the girl felt it was completely different from their kiss on the balcony. The man pulled away and looked at her tenderly, calling her Rosetta. She hadn't even realized he had this side to him. The man gently kissed the girl's neck with his lips, and she sighed deeply. He continued to kiss her, their fingers intertwined. Rosetta didn't understand how they had suddenly become like this. However, the man suddenly pulled away from the girl, sat up, and rubbed his face with his palms to calm himself. Then he said they should wait, that this was enough. With his hands still covering his face, the man said he didn't want to do anything right after confessing his feelings, especially since he was drunk. The girl looked at the man in confusion and said her wish was for the prince to be safe and sound and to see him when he was 34. The girl thought to herself that even if he didn't like her, as long as he was healthy, it was fine. Rosetta looked directly into the man's eyes and frankly and directly said she wanted him. The man desperately tried to restrain himself and finally asked her one question, which she regretted. The girl smiled at the man and said she would never. The man could no longer restrain himself and lunged at the girl. Dawn broke and the sun shone brightly on the earth. The girl, with her mouth slightly agape, Rosetta stared at the marks on her neck in the mirror, thinking this was an absolute nightmare. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by a man wearing only trousers. He entered the room and asked if she slept well. Rosetta asked if His Highness was awake. Suppressing a chuckle, the man asked why she was addressing him so formally now, after what happened last night. Rosetta recalled the passion of the previous night, how she had asked him to stop calling her by name, and how he, in turn, had demanded she say his name over and over, driving him mad. Rosetta stared at him, mouth slightly open, thinking she must have been crazy to call the prince by his name. She laughed awkwardly and said she needed to get back to work, her time off was over. The man looked surprised, stating she couldn't be a maid anymore. However, Rosetta had already reached the door. As she closed it, she wished him a good day. The man stood stunned, watching her leave, surprised by her hasty retreat. Clutching her head, Rosetta walked down the hallway, thinking if she ever touched alcohol again, she'd become a mad dog. She tried not to dwell on the most important matter. For a night, being intimate with the person they were sworn to protect was incredibly dangerous. Rosetta thought that if the prince died again, time would rewind, and she would have to watch her beloved disappear once more. And not just her master. Gloomy, Rosetta wondered if she could bear all. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by a man's voice asking if anyone had seen a girl. Rosetta watched the prince talking to someone, wondering if he was looking for her. As she turned, she thought this couldn't happen. Rosetta avoided the man's gaze. Only one thought flashing through her mind. She had to escape. Standing around the corner with her head down, Rosetta realized the prince's persistence was beyond her expectations. Suddenly, she heard someone call her name, breaking her train of thought. Rosetta saw Melanie. Melanie asked her where she was going in such a hurry. Rosetta said she was going to work. Melanie looked surprised, asking if she was really going to clean. Melanie looked perplexed. Clearly, something was going on with the prince. Something seemed amiss. Rosetta thanked Melanie for her help yesterday, but Melanie said she should be the one thanking Rosetta, as she owed her a great deal. Melanie handed Rosetta a ribbon, saying she had a gift for her. As she gave it to Rosetta, Melanie said it was something for adults and told her to hide it quickly. Rosetta, excited, asked why she was giving her such a thing. Melanie looked startled by the question, saying, "It's written all over your neck." Last night was obviously fun. Rosetta's mouth dropped open in surprise, realizing everyone had seen the marks. She clenched her fists and told Melanie it was a misunderstanding, that she and the prince had only become a couple yesterday. Melanie looked shocked, saying she hadn't realized they weren't together before. Winking, Melanie congratulated her and said she had to run before she was caught chatting and punished. Rosetta thanked Melanie for the gift, but feeling it might cause trouble, tucked it into her pocket. A day passed, and Rosetta was still avoiding the man. She hid in every nook and cranny. A day passed, and the situation remained unchanged. Rosetta continued to avoid the prince, who was searching everywhere for her. Another day passed, and Rosetta maintained her habit of avoiding him. Rosetta continued to avoid Armand. Though she felt guilty, she hadn't yet sorted out her feelings. Pushing open the door to her room, she thought the day had been incredibly difficult. Suddenly, Rosetta stopped, hearing a man's voice greet her. A man sat on the sofa opposite, arms crossed. He asked Rosetta if she felt like they hadn't seen each other in a long time. The man looked displeased, staring intently at Rosetta. She gave an awkward laugh and asked His Highness what he was doing there. The man said flatly that he had come to see his beloved. Rosetta continued to laugh awkwardly, saying she was busy and couldn't see him. Hearing this, the man's face darkened. He said, surprised, that according to the head maid, Rosetta didn't have any tasks. Rosetta laughed awkwardly, saying she was just trying to find something to do. After listening to her, the man stood up. He asked Rosetta if it was just a coincidence that she tried to slip away every time they met. Rosetta realized she had taken too long to think and had made a mistake. The man stopped Rosetta, gently touching her lips with his thumb. Looking directly in her eyes, he said, "Since you said you needed me, why are you running away now?" Rosetta smiled, saying she just wanted to ensure the prince's safety. Prince Armand, however, called it a pathetic excuse for her avoidance. Inwardly, Rosetta's thoughts were entirely different. Prince Armand moved closer, ordering Rosetta to stop talking and open her mouth. He leaned down, pressing her against the wall, and kissed her. Rosetta clenched her fists, struggling to remain composed. She pleaded with the prince to wait, insisting this wasn't what she wanted. Suddenly, a familiar ribbon fell from Rosetta's pocket. Looking down, Prince Armand saw a red ribbon slip silently to the floor. Rosetta was shocked, having completely forgotten the gift she received a few days prior. Prince Armand chuckled, suggesting that Rosetta didn't want the kiss because she had other preferences. Rosetta lay on the bed, her hands bound by the red ribbon. Prince Armand told her he would do anything she desired. As she struggled against the ribbon, Melanie's image flashed through her mind. Morning arrived, and the palace filled with the hurried sounds of footsteps. Rosetta, naked, lay in Prince Armand's arms, wishing she could sleep longer. Rosetta sat up and turned to the prince, saying she needed to go to work. Prince Armand questioned who would dare make his beloved woman work. Wrapping herself in the sheets, Rosetta explained that being with him didn't absolve her of her responsibilities. If she didn't work, she couldn't prevent the assassination attempts against the prince, see Valerian, or continue interrogating the suspicious individuals. Prince Armand looked at her, acknowledging the importance of her work. Prince Armand smiled slyly at Rosetta, complaining of his loneliness and asking if she truly wanted to leave. A mixture of shyness and excitement filled her as she frankly admitted to enjoying his confessions, his compliments on her beauty, his smile, and even his kisses, though she was a little embarrassed. However, despite her feelings, Rosetta knew that staying by his side would prevent her from protecting him. The deeper her feelings grew, the stronger her fear of losing him became. Rosetta told the prince she had an appointment. He asked with whom, and she replied that it was with a friend. Prince Armand looked at her displeased, asking if it was the man she had mentioned before. Rosetta froze, wondering how he guessed it was Valerian. She had intended to be honest, but the prince was clearly jealous, so she decided to hide the truth. Thinking of protecting the prince, Rosetta told a white lie, saying she was going to see Melanie. Prince Armand told her to have fun. Looking at the prince, Rosetta suggested they go out for dinner or a show tomorrow, like lovers often do. Prince Armand was delighted with the suggestion and said he would find a suitable place. Rosetta stood at the door, calling for Valerian. Valerian stood there, his fists clenched. He asked Rosetta what had happened between her and the crown prince a few days ago. She had promised him she would refuse if Prince Armand confessed his feelings. He had always trusted his only sister. Therefore, he hadn't believed the rumors about the love bite on Rosetta's neck, even though everyone assumed she and Prince Armand were a couple. Seeing Rosetta awkwardly covering her neck, Valerian felt a surge of anger. She wouldn't meet his gaze, acting as if she had done something wrong. So he pressed her again, demanding to know what had happened between her and the crown prince. Blushing shyly, Rosetta admitted that she and the prince had unexpectedly become lovers. Valerian's eyes widened, surprised by her answer. Valerian couldn't understand how it could have happened unexpectedly and asked if the prince had forced her. Rosetta quickly reassured him that he hadn't. Valerian's jaw dropped when she confessed to liking the prince as well. So she had accepted him. Valerian had always seen her as a sister, so the idea of her being in a relationship felt strange, but why did the thought fill him with such resistance? Valerian congratulated Rosetta on finally having a man. Hearing about their date tomorrow and Rosetta's questions about what to wear, Valerian clenched his fists again. He knew these things all too well. He fought back the urge to ask where they were going, and Rosetta asked him why he wanted to know. Valerian smiled, explaining that what she wore depended on the location. Rosetta immediately began describing their date spot. Looking at her smile, he finally understood that what he had been feeling all along was jealousy. Valerian could barely contain his emotions. He finally realized that for all these years, he had believed he simply wanted Rosetta's happiness because she was family, his childhood friend. However, it was just a childish fantasy. The girl looked at the man and asked him what Duke Runner and the prince had talked about at the celebration. The man said the Duke wanted to help the prince, so he sided with his highness. The girl asked if they had talked about the engagement. The man comforted her, saying the prince had already refused it and confessed that he loved someone else. The girl lowered her eyes after hearing this. Hearing these words, she smiled happily. The man looked at the girl, thinking he still couldn't hand Rosetta over to such a man. As she walked, the girl thought that the prince seemed to be looking forward to their date, but he had been busy with work lately. Would everything go smoothly? Suddenly, she heard the prince's voice and froze. The man looked at the girl and said he missed her very much. The girl looked at the bouquet the prince had brought. The girl inhaled the fragrance of the flowers deeply, feeling incredibly happy. She asked if he had finished his work. The man countered by asking if work was the most important thing to her. He said he had started before dawn, so he had already completed all his duties. The girl asked about the flowers he had brought. The man explained that he gave them to her because she was born during the rose blooming season. The girl was surprised that he remembered something she had told him a long time ago. She apologized for not having prepared anything for him. The man said her smile was enough for him. The girl looked at the man and started to say how beautiful he was, with eyes like diamonds, a high-nosed bridge, and soft skin. The man looked at her in surprise, unexpected by the compliments. The man bashfully said that she was even more beautiful. The girl was amused by his reaction and decided to tease him more. The girl feigned a sigh and said that every time she complimented him on his handsomeness, others said she was crazy, which made her sad. The man was speechless with surprise. She continued, saying that since they were talking about the past, she remembered drinking poison for him and then being kidnapped. The man only managed to call out her name. The The man lowered his head and asked what he should do. Rosetta laughed happily and said she was just joking and told him not to be nervous. The girl smiled and said everything would be all right, even if there were difficulties. As long as the prince was by her side, they could overcome anything. The man looked at the girl emotionally and said he felt the same way. Rosetta walked, holding up her skirt and looking around. She said she had heard of this place and that it was said to have a months-long waiting list. So why was it so empty today? Armand didn't answer, only saying he hoped she liked it. The girl thought excitedly that he had really booked all the seats, just for this one night. The girl looked at the prince, thinking that he hadn't cared about luxury before, and she hadn't expected him to do something like this. What should she do? At that moment, the prince told her to order whatever she liked, looking at her and thinking that this date had to be wonderful. If all went well, Rosetta would tell him she loved him. The man knew it was still too early, but he wanted to propose to her soon. The girl looked through the menu and asked His Highness to choose for her. The man, thinking that he wanted to be with her forever, said of course he would help her. Suddenly, the restaurant door was pushed open and a male voice greeted the prince. They both turned to the door, waiting for the person who had called out to the prince to appear. Valerian walked calmly through the hallway, his hand on his chest. He apologized for interrupting them, saying he had something urgent to discuss. The girl looked at the man in surprise, wondering how he could be here. The prince also asked the mage why he had come. The man said he had a lot to say to the prince, but he couldn't say it in the palace. The prince looked at him angrily and asked if it was really worth interrupting their date. The girl looked at the two of them and wondered why they were acting like this. Even if there was an emergency, Valerian shouldn't have come now, even though he had helped her before. After all, this was a date. To ease the tension, the girl stood up and said it was all right, and since everyone was here, they might as well eat together. Valerian immediately thanked her. Armand immediately asked the mage, since when he had been allowed to call her Rosetta directly. The girl looked at the man and said she had given him permission at the last celebration. The prince was puzzled. Why they started calling each other by their first names. The Grand Mage was a gentle young man whose appearance was also in line with Rosetta's aesthetic preferences. The man thought that if he showed jealousy, he might hurt the girl. He forced himself to remain calm and asked what urgent matter had brought him here. Valerian, hands clasped before him, looked at the prince and said he'd learned that someone among the first prince's attendants had purchased poison. Both Prince Armand and Rosetta were shocked by the news. When the prince asked what kind of poison, Valerian replied that it was called moonberry, colorless, and odorless. Valerian explained that once ingested, the victim would become euphoric but would die 5 minutes later. Rosetta clutched her skirt, thinking she'd never heard of such a poison. This situation suggested that the first prince was enraged by the increased likelihood of Armand's ascension to the throne. Prince Armand looked at Rosetta and said he had to attend the hunt. Valerian said there was no need to panic, as the poison could be detected using the teaspoon he had given the prince. Rosetta looked at the mage and gave a puzzled smile. Rosetta gradually realized that the matter wasn't actually urgent. Suddenly, a waiter entered the room, apologizing, and presented the first course. The waiter placed a dish before Rosetta, announcing it as mushroom pasta with a poached egg. Valerian suddenly told him to wait. Rosetta looked at him questioningly. He smiled and said that Rosetta didn't eat mushrooms. After this statement, a tense silence fell over the table. Prince Armand, struggling to contain his emotions, asked how he knew that. Valerian smiled and said they had discussed mushroom salad at a banquet once. Trying to lighten the mood, Rosetta chimed in, confirming that such a conversation had indeed taken place. Another tense silence descended upon the table. The prince clenched his fists, wondering if the mage was provoking him. Rosetta, acutely aware of the prince's mood, stood and declared she was full and didn't want to eat anymore, reminding him that they should be going to the theater. Resting his chin on his clasped hands, Valerian agreed with Rosetta's suggestion, adding that his stomach wasn't feeling well either, and it would be best to return to the palace. Then, lowering his voice so only Rosetta could hear, he asked why she was still addressing the prince so formally, finding it rather odd. Rosetta stared at the mage in bewilderment, only one thought occupying her mind. Why was he doing this? Noticing Rosetta still looking at Valerian, the prince called her name and took a step closer, reminding her that they should leave. They sat in their private box in the beautiful theater. Rosetta looked down, thinking how comfortable the seats were and how wonderful the view was. The performance was equally captivating, but she still couldn't concentrate. Rosetta noticed that the prince seemed upset. Suddenly, placing his hand on his knee, he called her name. The prince stood and walked to the edge of the box, saying she knew he got jealous easily. After drawing the curtain, he turned to her and said it was best not to speak too enthusiastically about anyone in front of him. Rosetta looked up at the prince and asked if it was because of Valerian, but then she suddenly sighed, her hands beginning to tremble. The prince leaned down, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her, practically pinning her to the seat. It was a fierce, lingering kiss before they finally parted. Taking a deep breath, the prince knelt on one knee on the seat and brushed his thumb across her damp lips. Rosetta could only whisper that they were still in the theater. In truth, whenever the elegant crowned prince took risks for her sake, she didn't feel guilty, but rather a thrill of pleasure. Running a hand through his hair and loosening his tie, the prince said he really wanted to rip her dress off right then. Rosetta looked at him, her heart pounding. Stroking her head, the prince said they couldn't do that in a public place. Rosetta watched him, not realizing it was already over. The prince sat further away, no longer touching her, his hands clenched. Rosetta didn't understand why he was restraining himself, nor why she cared. The prince said that sometimes he felt he loved her more than she loved him. Rosetta exclaimed that it was impossible. The prince made a request that was important to him. He wanted her to call him by his name. Suspecting this was because of Valerian, Rosetta asked what she should do. The prince immediately crossed his arms. Now, in Rosetta's eyes, the prince resembled a sulking cat. She stared at the pouting prince in surprise. Rosetta stammered, softly calling the prince's name, Armand. The prince froze at the sound, realizing what she had said, and then smiled tenderly, his eyes full of love. Prince Armand looked at Rosetta, gently stroking her hair and praising her for doing well. Before they continued their evening, he requested that she always address him this way from now on, as he didn't want to be on the same level as that foolish mage. Late into the night, the carriage carried them home. Prince Armand pressed close to Rosetta, his arm around her waist, his head near hers, whispering how much he truly enjoyed this. Rosetta turned to the prince and asked how he could enjoy it if he hadn't even watched the performance. Prince Armand replied that watching her was far more entertaining than any show. As the carriage continued on its way, the prince suddenly asked Rosetta if she knew how poor the soundproofing of the carriage was, and that they still had a long way to go. Prince Armand leaned closer to Rosetta's ear and softly asked if he could touch her. Rosetta was startled by the question, but the prince didn't move away from her ear when she addressed him formally again. The prince immediately corrected her, stating his name, which Rosetta obediently repeated. She pressed her palm to her cheek and said she had a condition. Prince Armand smiled at Rosetta, urging her to tell him, as he had been worried she wouldn't ask him for anything. Rosetta thanked the prince, her hand on her chest, and requested that he take her to the hunting festival. Prince Armand looked at Rosetta in confusion, agreeing to her request, but explaining that he would be leaving with the hunters and it would be a long time before he returned, so she needn't wait for him. However, Rosetta corrected him, saying she wanted to go hunting with him. Upon hearing this, Prince Armand said he would absolutely not do that. Rosetta looked at the prince in surprise, saying that if he was worried about her, he shouldn't forget how strong she was. However, the prince remained unwavering, arms crossed, refusing. Rosetta angrily declared that if that was the case, she would never kiss him again. Prince Armand turned to Rosetta in surprise, asking what she meant. Rosetta loudly declared that she would never kiss him again, nor call his name, nor do anything else. From the poorly soundproof carriage, the girl's angry shouts could be heard. Prince Armand looked at Rosetta, completely baffled as to how their conversation had taken such a turn. He reached out to her, saying that was simply impossible. Rosetta grew angrier, yelling at the prince not to touch her and giving him an ultimatum. Unless he took her hunting with him, he was allowed nothing. Prince Armand looked at the angry Rosetta, thinking that she was adorable even like this, and he couldn't resist. He looked at Rosetta, who was hugging herself, and figured she would eventually relent. The carriage continued to carry them home, Prince Armand wondering if everything would work out, but his worries were soon realized. From that day on, Rosetta began avoiding him. She never called his name again, nor allowed him to kiss her. Prince Armand sat sadly on the sofa, feeling as if they were back to their initial relationship, where all he could do was hold her hand. At that moment, Prince Armand made up his mind. He wasn't going to agree to Rosetta's request, but instead decided to tempt her to make her break her promise and kiss him herself. The prince had good reason to refuse Rosetta, even if it meant losing her kisses. Because every time he returned from hunting, something terrible happened, so he didn't regret his decision. Rosetta walked silently down the hallway. Thinking back on her interactions with the prince over the past few days, she felt truly miserable. Approaching her door, she noticed it was slightly ajar, with a light on inside. Rosetta looked at him with concern, asking why His Highness wasn't asleep yet. Prince Armand looked at Rosetta silently, his eyes burning. Rosetta froze, looking at the prince, wondering if he was having another episode. Prince Armand sat on the bed, gazing at her. Without saying a word, he suddenly asked Rosetta if she had come play. Hearing this, Rosetta, thinking his tone was normal, asked him how he was feeling. Prince Armand got out of bed and walked towards Rosetta. As he walked, he untied the sash of his robe. After taking it off, the prince took Rosetta's hand and placed it on his chest. Rosetta looked at the prince and asked what he was doing. Prince Armand calmly admitted he was tempting her. He let her hand glide over his abs, asking if she liked it. Rosetta's cheeks flushed, and she asked him excitedly. But her expression suddenly darkened, and she told the prince that he was completely in control of his actions. Rosetta told the confused prince that he never called her name when he had his episodes. Prince Armand touched his face with his finger, admitting he had forgotten, which infuriated Rosetta. With his hand behind his head, the man said he remembered some things, but certainly not everything. He asked if Rosetta had been treating him like a cat, mentioning he remembered her teasing him with a feather duster, implying she must have owned a cat before. Rosetta was shocked that Prince Armand remembered her actions. Waving her hands agitatedly, she asked if he truly remembered. The prince reassured her, saying everything was all right. Pulling her closer, the man admitted he quite enjoyed her reward kisses when he was being good. He pressed close to Rosetta, whispering in her ear that whenever she wasn't around, he was driven nearly mad with excitement. Armand said he'd been through a lot, and now it was his turn to tempt her. The man embraced Rosetta, slowly untying the ribbon of her apron. Drugged, Rosetta no longer resisted him. Pinned beneath him on the bed, Rosetta thought that at this rate, she wouldn't be able to resist him any longer. A displeased expression crossed her face as she lay naked in the prince's arms. Turning to look at him, she cursed inwardly. If it weren't for his handsome face, none of this trouble would be happening. Rosetta brought a hand to her forehead, realizing she could no longer obtain permission. She walked forward, thinking she would just have to follow him secretly from now on. As she rushed out the door, Rosetta pleaded with Valerian to save her. The man, who had been reading, turned to look at her. He asked Rosetta if she didn't think it was rude to ask for his help without even sending a letter first. Rosetta retorted, asking if she would care about such things after what happened a few days ago. The man suddenly confessed that he had been waiting for her, knowing she hadn't contacted him. The man approached Rosetta, commenting that it seemed she only spoke to him when she needed help. Hearing this, Rosetta froze. Feeling guilty, she quietly apologized. However, the man said there was no need to apologize, admitting his own rudeness and suggesting they forget about it. He asked Rosetta what she wanted this time. Rosetta pressed a hand to her chest, excitedly asking him to help her participate in the hunt. Valerian asked if she really wanted to go to the festival. Clasping her hands together, Rosetta said she did want to secretly follow His Highness and protect him. The man then asked if it was worth the risk. Rosetta looked away, sadly saying she didn't know, but she had a bad feeling. The man clenched his fist as Rosetta pleaded with him in a soft voice for his help. Pressing her hands to her chest, she said he knew she couldn't handle it without him. Valerian chuckled, saying his Rose truly knew how to act spoiled. Looking at Rosetta, the man thought to himself, how could he refuse such a lovely face? Rosetta excitedly thanked him, opening her arms as if to hug him. But she suddenly stopped. The man immediately noticed and asked what was wrong, wondering if her lover had truly forbidden her from touching him. Rosetta quickly waved her hands, denying it and saying their relationship was complicated. She hadn't explained things clearly to Armand yet and wasn't sure if she should still be as close to him as before. The man quickly changed the subject, asking when she started calling the prince by his name. The man took a step closer, asking what she meant by close. As he closed the distance, he asked if this was considered close. With that, The man kissed Rosetta on the cheek and pulled back, watching her blush as he asked if a light kiss like that was permissible. Rosetta angrily called out the man's name. The man calmly replied that even children could kiss their older sisters if they didn't know any better. Rosetta retorted, asking where there was a man who was a child. The man replied that she was the one who started treating him like a child. Rosetta was rendered speechless by this logic and could only tell the man that she couldn't refuse him, asking him to return to the topic of the festival. Rosetta checked the horse the prince would be riding for the hunt, then his weapons, ensuring everything was in order. She also checked the food, making sure it wasn't poisoned. Only the clothes remained, so Rosetta offered to help him dress. She remembered that in her past life, Armand had died from a poisoned needle hidden in his shirt. The man reminded her that she should call him by his name, commenting that she seemed happy today. He then pinched her chin with his fingers, suggesting they play a bit before they left. Rosetta immediately swatted his hand away, telling him to stop, saying her heart was about to stop. However, the girl stopped abruptly after hearing the prince's question, asking if she had prepared anything for him. According to tradition, women would give their partners a valuable gift before the festival. However, the girl had been so focused on ensuring his safety that she completely forgot to prepare a gift. Now she stood there, flustered, approaching the man and apologizing softly for forgetting. The man reassured her, saying it was her first time participating in the festival, so it was understandable, and told her to relax because he was only joking. As the girl helped him into his shirt, he asked if she still wanted to go with him. While buttoning his shirt, he offered to find her better clothes. The girl assumed the prince was worried that other nobles wouldn't give her the proper respect. The girl reached out to button his shirt, saying she was more comfortable in these clothes and that if it was truly inconvenient, she would leave on her own. As she fastened his cuffs, he replied that if anyone offended her, she should just remember his name and tell him. At the thought of this, the man's face darkened instantly, saying he would make that bastard's life a living hell. The girl gave a nervous laugh, thinking she wasn't in a position to refuse. The girl changed the subject, asking if there would be fireworks at the festival. The man nodded, saying there would be even more lights than the last time she saw them. He took the girl's hand and invited her to watch the fireworks together. The girl smiled happily, thinking that after the hunt was successfully completed, she would definitely watch the fireworks with Armand. As they left the castle, she hoped everything would go smoothly. Several people were in the festival procession, including the elderly butler Malcolm and the knight Richard. Due to concerns about the prince's health, Father Theodore had also been invited, and of course she, the prince's companion, was also in the festival entourage. Sitting in the carriage, the girl thought that the hunting grounds were certainly safe, but she was still very worried about the man's safety. Finally, the carriage arrived, and they were informed that His Highness, the Crown Prince, had arrived. The man stepped out of the carriage and extended his hand to the girl. People saw the girl and whispered about her simple dress. Rose thought, was it the most cutting remark they could come up with? She certainly didn't want to be a laughingstock, but this dress was the most practical for movement, all for the sake of protecting His Highness. The man sensed the girl's nervousness and was about to say something, but the girl interrupted him, saying she remembered and that he shouldn't worry. The girl thought she needed to look around later and slip away discreetly, feigning illness. Her thoughts were interrupted by a female voice calling her name and the snap of a fan. The girl said she wanted to congratulate Rose. Lady Reniella said she'd heard everything was going well between Rose and the prince.